عندي يا زلمة مرضان صوتي الأسبوع
والله
الجاي.
ما
عندي
صار
مباراة
أسبوع ما لعبنا.
عندي مباراة MMA اليوم ضد واحد سيمي بروفيشنال. ولا ألعب ضده مرضان ما بعرف.
شو الأكونت اللي فاتح والله؟
آه. أخي ير
لا شو اليوزر نيم؟
get XP 0.
Is the price of a product that will lower the quantity demanded for the
راح أبعت
product.
لك لوبي.
Quantity demanded will go down, and you can imagine the other side of that. If we lower the price of a product, that will raise the quantity demanded. The quantity demanded of that product. And the law of demand says this just kind of generally. What we'll see in a few videos from now is that there are some exceptions to this. But to make this a little concrete, let's think about the demand for a certain product. And one thing I want to clear here, and I'm going to go through great pains to not mess this up, is that when we talk about the word demand in an economic sense, in a formal economic sense, we're not talking about a quantity. We're actually going to talk all else equal, ceteris paribus, all of the relationship between price and quantity demanded. If we talk about an actual quantity, we should say the quantity demanded. So demand versus quantity demanded. These are two different things, and if it's a little confusing to you right now, hopefully by the end of this video, the difference between demand and quantity demanded will become a little bit clearer, and definitely over the next few videos, because in this video we're going to focus on how the quantity demanded changes relative to price. In future videos we'll talk about how the entire relationship, how demand changes based on different factors. But to make things concrete, let's say I'm about to release my science fiction book, space whatever, I don't know, the book that I want to release. So I'm going to release some ebook. And we've done some market study, or we just know how the price is, or how the demand is related to price, or the price is related to demand. And we're going to show that in a demand schedule. Which is really just a table that just shows how the price, and actually I made my first mistake. I just said how price relates to demand. I should say how price relates to quantity demanded, and how quantity demanded relates to price. So a demand schedule, it shows a relationship between price and quantity demanded, all else equal. So we're going to have multiple scenarios here. So this column, let me do my scenarios. This column, let me put my price. And this column, let me put my quantity demanded. So scenario, let's call this scenario A. I could price my book at $2. And I'll get a ton of people downloading it at that price. So I will get 60,000 people download my book at that price, my ebook. Scenario B, I could raise the price by $2, so it's now $4, and then that kills off a lot of the demand. Now the quantity demanded goes down to 40,000 people downloading it. Then I could go to scenario C. If I raise by another $2, so now I'm at $6. Now that lowers the quantity demanded to 30,000. I'll do a couple more of these. Scenario D, I raise another $2, so I get $8 now. Now the quantity demanded goes down to 25,000, and I'll do one more of these. Let's see, what color have I not used yet?
Shaking.
Scenario E, if I raise it to 10.
عبرجف معناته.
Now the quantity demanded, let's just say it is 23,000. So this relationship between this shows the law of demand right over here, and this table that shows how the quantity demanded relates to price and vice versa, this is what we call a demand schedule. Now we can also, based on this demand schedule, draw a demand curve, and really we're just going to plot these points and draw the curve that connects them, because we don't have to just, these aren't the only scenarios. Anything in between is possible. We could charge $2.01 for the book. We could charge $4.50 for the book. And so that's what the demand curve captures a little bit better, because it's a continuous curve, not just 5 points. So let's do that. Let's graph it. And this is one of those conventions of economics that I am not a fan of, because people often talk about changing the price and how the quantity demanded changes from that. And in most of math and science, the thing that you're changing, you normally put on the horizontal axis. So if I was in charge of the convention of economics, I would plot price on the horizontal axis right over here. But the way it's done typically is that price is done on the vertical axis, and so you're used to seeing it in kind of a traditional class environment. I'll do the same. So we'll put price in the vertical axis, and we'll put quantity demanded in the horizontal axis. And our quantity demanded goes all the way up to 60,000. So that's, let's see, that's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. So that's 10, this is in thousand, 20, 30, 40, sorry, not 45, 40, 50, and 60. And this is in thousands. This is in thousands. And then the price goes up to $10, from $2 to $10. So let's say this is 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. So let's plot the scenarios. So scenario A, price is $2, 60,000 units are demanded. That is scenario A, right over there. Scenario B, when the price is $4, 40,000 units are demanded. $4, 40,000 units. That's right over there. That's scenario B. Scenario C, $6, 30,000 units. $6, 30,000 units. Right over there. Scenario C. Scenario D, $8, 25,000 units. $8.25 is right about there. That looks like 25,000 right in between. That's close enough. So that right over there is scenario D. Scenario D. And then finally scenario E, $10, 23 units. $10, 23,000 units. So something like that. That is scenario E. And so we could actually have prices anywhere in between that, and maybe we could even go further. So this right over here, so if I were to draw the demand curve, it could look something like this. The demand curve would look something, I'm trying to do
اروح
my
على
best to
neighbor
draw
by
it as a
lobby
straight
واعمل لك
continuous
invite.
line.
لا
Something like that, and it could keep
ايه
going on and on. And so these are two ways to show demand. So just going back to what I said earlier, the quantity demanded is all else equal for a given price, how many units people are willing to download or buy of my ebook. When we talk about the demand itself, we're talking about this entire relationship. So this demand itself is this entire demand schedule, or another way to think of it is this entire demand curve. If demand were to change, we would actually have a different curve. This curve would shift, or the entries in this table would shift. If the quantity of demand changes, so we move along this curve when you hold everything else equal and you only change price. So hopefully that makes that clear. When everything else is equal and you're only changing price, you're not changing demand, you're changing the quantity demanded. The demand, because everything else is equal, is this relationship. In the next few videos, we'll think about what does happen when you do change some of those other factors. We've talked a little bit about the law of demand, which tells us all else equal, if we raise the price of a product, then the quantity demanded for that product will go down. Common sense. If we lower the price, then the quantity demanded will go up. And we'll see a few special cases for this. But what I want to do in this video is focus on these other things that we've been holding equal, the things that allow us to make this statement, that allow us to move along this curve. And think about if we were to change one of those things that we were otherwise considering equal, how does that change the actual curve? How does that actually change the whole quantity demanded price relationship? And so the first of these that I will focus on, the first is the price of competing products. The price of competing products. So if you assume that the price of, actually I shouldn't say competing products, I'll say the price of related products, because we'll see that they're not all competing. The price of related products is one of the things that we're assuming is constant when it's being held equal when we show this relationship. We're assuming that these other things aren't changing. Now, what would happen if these things changed? Well, imagine we have other ebooks, books' price goes up. The price of other ebooks go up. So what will that do to our price quantity demanded relationship? If other ebooks prices go up, now all of a sudden my ebook, regardless of what price point we're at any of the price points, my ebook is going to look more desirable. At $2, it's more likely that people will want it, more people will want it because the other stuff's more expensive. At $4, more people will want it. At $6, more people will want it. $8, more people will want it. $10, more people will want it. So if this were to happen, that would actually shift the entire demand curve to the right. So it would start to look something like this. It would look something like that. We'll call that scenario. That is scenario 1. And these other ebooks, we can call them substitutes for my product. So this right over here, these other ebooks, these are substitutes. If people might say, oh, that other book looks kind of comparable. If one is more expensive, if one is cheaper, maybe I'll read one or the other. So in order to make this statement, in order to stay along this curve, we have to assume that this thing is constant. If this thing changes, this is going to move the curve. If other ebooks prices go up, it'll probably shift our curve to the right. If other ebooks prices go down, that will shift our entire curve to the left. So this is actually changing our demand. It's changing our whole relationship. So it's shifting demand to the right. So let me write that. So this is going to shift demand. So the entire relationship, demand to the right. I really want to make sure you have this point clear. When we hold everything else equal, we're moving along a given demand curve. We're essentially saying the demand, the price quantity demanded relationship is held constant, and we can pick a price and we'll get a certain quantity demanded. We're moving along the curve. If we change one of those things, we might actually shift the curve. We'll actually change this demand schedule.
لك حدا
and
بيستحي
we'll
بأصلك
change
فهد.
this curve. Now, there are other related products. They don't just have to be substitutes.
والله
So, for
تمام الحمد
example,
لله. كيفك أنت؟
let's think about scenario 2,
الحمد لله.
where maybe the price of a Kindle goes up. So the price of a Kindle, Kindle's, let me write this way. Kindle's price goes up. Now the Kindle is not a substitute. People don't either buy an ebook or they won't either buy my ebook or buy Kindle. Kindle is a complement. You actually need a Kindle or an iPad or something like it in order to consume my ebook. So this right over here is a complement. It is a complement. So if a complement's price becomes more expensive, and this is something that's one of the things people might use to buy my book, then it would actually, for any given price, lower the quantity demanded. So in this situation, if my book is $2, since fewer people are going to have Kindles, or maybe they've used some of their money already to buy the Kindle, they're going to have less to buy my book, or fewer people will have the Kindle. For any given price, it's going to lower the quantity demanded. For any given price, And so it essentially will shift, it'll change the entire demand curve. It'll shift the demand curve to the left. So this right over here is scenario 2. And you can imagine the other way. If the Kindle's price went down, then that would shift my demand curve to the right. If the price of substitutes went down, then that would shift my entire curve to the left. So you can think about all the scenarios. And actually, I encourage you to think about, draw them yourself. Think about for products, it could be an ebook or it could be some other type of product. And think about what would happen. Well, one, think about what the related products are, the substitutes and potentially complements. And then think what would happen as those prices change. And always keep in mind the difference between demand, which is this entire relationship, the entire curve that we can move along if we hold everything else equal and only change price, and quantity demanded, which is a particular quantity for a particular price holding everything else equal. So we've been going through all of the other things that we were assuming are held constant in order to be moving along one demand curve. And now let's list a few other. And before I do any more of them, let's talk about the ones we already talked about. So one, we said that one of the things we held constant, we write this down. Held constant. One of the things that we held constant on the move along one demand curve, for the demand itself to not shift, for the curve to not shift, is price of related goods. The other thing we assumed that's being held constant is price expectations for our good. Price expectations. And now we'll list a couple of them that are fairly intuitive, but you'll see in the next few videos that there are often special cases even to this. So the other thing that we've been holding constant to stay on one demand curve is income. And this one is fairly intuitive. What happens if everyone's income were to increase? And in real terms, it were to actually increase. Well, then all of a sudden they have more disposable income, maybe to spend on something like ebooks. And so for any given price point, the demand would increase. And so it would increase the demand. And once again, when we talk about increasing demand, we're talking about shifting the entire curve. We're not talking about a particular quantity of demand. So income goes up, then it increases.
فاضي ولا عندك التزامات اليوم؟
والله قاعد على بدرس وبلعب كونتر.
نايس مين؟
يا حبيبي عم بدرس صوتي
demand
وكذا.
goes up. And remember, when we're talking about income, when demand goes up, we're talking about the whole curve shifting to the right. At any given price point, we're going to have a larger quantity demanded. So the whole curve, this whole demand schedule would change. And likewise, if income went down, demand would go down. And we're going to see in a future video, it's actually quite interesting, that's always not the case. This is only true for normal goods. This is only true for normal goods. And in a future video, we'll see goods called inferior goods where this is not necessarily the case. Or by definition for an inferior good, it would not be the case. Now, the other ones that are somewhat intuitive are population. Once again, if population goes up, obviously at any given price point, more people will want it, so it would shift the demand curve to the right, or it would increase demand. If population were to go down, it would decrease demand, which means shifting the whole curve to the left. And then the last one we'll talk about, and remember, we're holding all of these things constant in order for demand not to change. The last thing is just preferences. We're assuming that people's tastes and preferences don't change while we move along a specific demand curve. If preferences actually change, then it will change the curve. So, for example, if all of a sudden the author of the book is on some very popular talk show that tells everyone that this is the best book that was ever written, then preferences would go up, and that would increase the total demand. At any given price point, more people would be willing to buy the book. If, on the other hand, on that same talk show, it turns out that they do an expose on the author having this, sordid past, and the author plagiarized the whole book, then the demand will go down. The entire curve, regardless of the price point, at any given price point, the quantity demanded will actually go down. What I want to do in this video is think about the demand curve for two different products. So this is some laptop that's on the market, and let's just say is the cheapest car that happens to be on the market. This is actually a picture of a 1985 Yugo, but we're just assuming it's the cheapest car in the market. So let's just think
مش دخل
about
مصاري.
their hypothetical
Big
demand
net.
curves right now. So once again, in the vertical axis, we're going to put price. And the horizontal axis, we put quantity. Quantity.
نايس فهد
And
تفهم.
then over here, let me do it for the same thing. So this is price.
السموك لق
This is price, and this right
أيوة
over
مطرح ما
here
أنت معي
is
مطرح
بلع
quantity.
بلع بلع هات.
And both of them satisfy the law of
في واحد
demand.
كمان في واحد
If
كمان
the price is really high, the quantity demanded is going to be really low for the laptop. And so it might be right over there. And if the price is low, the quantity demanded is going to increase. So it might, the demand curve might look something like that. And it doesn't have to be a curve, or it doesn't have to be a line. It could be a curve. It could be anything like that. So that is the
عبزتني
current
إيدات حبيبي
demand
خلصوا.
for the laptop.
زد زد
So
طيسي.
this is the current demand, all else equal. So we're not talking about shifting any of those other factors that we've been talking about in the last few videos. Now we could draw a similar demand curve for this very cheap automobile. If the price is high, very few people are going to want to buy it. And I'm not going to even specify what the price is, but this is a general idea. If the price is higher, fewer people are going to want to buy it. If the price is lower, more people are going to want to buy it. So its demand curve will also have this shape. From the top left to the bottom right, it satisfies the law of demand. So once again, that is the current demand. Current demand. Now let's think about how the demand for each of these goods might change depending on changes in income. So we're going to focus on the income factor, the income effect for this video, and see how these two products
دخلت
might
لك نت.
change. So let's just assume that income in the general population goes up. So for something like a laptop, wow, if more people are making more money, especially in real terms, they have more money to spend. Well, at any given price point, there's going to be a higher quantity that's demanded. At any given price point, higher quantity demanded. At any price point, a higher quantity demanded. And so if income goes up for this laptop, the demand will increase. And the way we show demand increasing is the whole curve shifts to the right. So this right over here, demand increased. Demand went up when income went up. And that makes complete sense. And if income were to go down, demand would go down because people would have less money to buy something like a laptop. And this is the case for most goods. And we call things like this, when income goes up, demand goes up, the whole curve shifts to the right. Income goes down, demand goes down, whole curve shifts to the left. We call this a normal good. So this right over here is a normal good. Now let's think about what happens with the cheapest car on the market. And let's assume that we are in a developed country where almost everyone has some form of a car. Now, what happens when income goes up? So people have more money, but are they going to spend that money buying the cheapest car on the market? Well, in most cases, if income goes up generally, people say, well, I have a little bit more money now, maybe I'll buy a slightly nicer car. So, and maybe in particular, the people who were going to buy this car at any given price point. So at this price point, the people who were going to buy the car will say, wait, I can now afford a better car. Why should I go, this is not safe maybe, or not as safe as the other cars. And I want to impress my friends from high school and all of that. So something very strange might happen for this car, right? For the demand for this car. It actually will decrease. So the whole curve could shift to the left. The whole curve could shift to the left. So income did a very strange thing for this good. Because income increasing made people say, hey, you know what? I could trade out of this good. I could get a good that I'd rather have than just getting more of this thing right over here. Demand went down. And goods like this we call inferior goods. Inferior goods. And the general way to think about inferior goods are the goods that people will want to not own if they had more money. They would want to buy, I guess, less inferior goods. Or another way to think about it is, if income were to go down, and more people are budget strapped and they can't afford the Mercedes-Benz or the BMW or even the mid-size sedan anymore. So if incomes were to go down and things were to get tighter, more people would want this car. More people would have to trade down to this because they're strapped, they're tightening their belts. And so you would have the strange situation where if income goes down, demand would go up for this thing. So income goes down, demand goes up. And remember, when we're talking about demand, we're talking about the entire shifting of the curve. At any given price point, the quantity demanded will go up because this is we're assuming it's the cheapest car on the market. So, and likewise, if income were to go down, for a normal good, it would do what you expect. Demand would go down. So an inferior good does the opposite of a normal good, and that's when we're talking about the income effect, and this is important. When we're talking about the income effect, an inferior good will do the opposite of a normal good, and that's because people want to trade out of it when their income goes up, or they don't want to buy it, they want to buy something nicer, and when income goes down, they say, oh, I have to buy this thing, so let me just do it. I sensed some confusion coming out of the last video on inferior goods, so I thought I would do another one. So let's assume that there's 3 cars in the market. And what I want to do this is I sense that some people thought that I was suggesting that a car in general is an inferior good, and that's not what I was saying. I was saying if we lived in a reality where everyone owned a car was a necessity for life, and that is true in much of the developed world, I was saying that the cheapest car on the market might be considered an inferior good. And to think about that, let's just think about the entire population. So let's say this line represents the entire population in our place, in our developed country where everyone owns a car. And let's represent this car with blue. So let's say maybe a third of the people right now have that car. And let's say a good chunk of the people have this mid-size sedan. This is probably the car that most people would like to have. It's a little bit safer, it's a little bit larger, it's a more powerful engine. And so this is where most people are sitting. Where most people are sitting. And then you have this kind of luxury, luxury car, a Rolls Royce maybe. And so that a very small segment. So this end of the line is the poor. So this is the poor in our population, and this is the rich. This is the rich right over here. So this is at some given income level, and maybe we could say this is true at a particular price point, but we'll see. What we're going to talk about is the general impact on demand. So on the entire curve at any given price point, always assuming that this is the most expensive, this is in between, and this is the least expensive. Now what happens if income goes up from here? Income goes up. Well, the very poorest, they're not going to be able to necessarily just trade up to this mid-size sedan yet, although they'll maybe have more income for other things, or maybe they can get a nicer version of this. But for the most part, they're still going to be driving this car. But at kind of the boundary right over here, if incomes do go up, there will be people who now can afford the mid-sized car, and that's what they want. And so these people might start buying the mid-sized car. And then what will happen over here? Well, maybe there's a few people at the boundary over here. They now have the money to afford this very expensive car, and it suits their taste. And so they also, a small proportion also grows there. So what happened here? When income went up, the quantity demanded at a particular price point for this smallest car went down. But the demand for this mid-sized car went up. It took a much bigger chunk out of this blue than a chunk was taken out of it by the orange. And also the demand for this very expensive car. And this very expensive car went up. And that was at a particular price point. But assuming that this is the most expensive, this is the middle, and this is the cheapest expensive, this would be true of probably any price point. And so we have this phenomenon that when income went up, the quantity demanded at multiple price points for this car. So let me draw its actual demand curve. So this car right over here, this is price. This over here is demand. If its old demand curve looks something like this, we're saying, and maybe, when we thought about this at first, we were thinking of the price point right over here. We noticed when income went up, at that particular price point, the quantity demanded went down, and that would be true pretty much any price point, assuming that this is always the cheapest car. So at any price point, you would have a decrease in demand. And remember, when we talk about a decrease in demand, we're talking about a shift of the entire curve. We're not talking about just one particular quantity. Now, there was another interesting question that was asked, and I think it was a very nice and subtle thing to think about. I keep drawing these shifting demand curves, And if at least I understand the question
يا أخي
properly,
وراي الأخير.
the question is, well, does the curve when it shifts, does it necessarily shift perfectly, or does sometimes it change? Does it shift more at one price point or another? And the simple answer is it can. In fact, in very few circumstances would it probably be a perfect shift. Depending on the price point you're at, it would probably shift a little bit different. So the actual shape of the curve might change while it's shifting. But anyway, going back to this, so we see that this cheap car right here had the unusual property that when incomes went up, the demand curve shifted to the left. And that's why we call this an inferior good. These other two cars, so that's price and this is demand. These other two cars, when income went up, so if this was the demand curve at first, if this is the demand curve at first, when income went up, demand went up. The whole curve got shifted to the right. So they are normal. So these are normal goods. We've talked a lot about demand, so now let's talk about supply, and we'll use grapes as this example. We'll pretend to be grape farmers of some sort. So I will start by introducing you, and maybe I'll do it in purple in honor of the grapes, to the law of supply, which, like the law of demand, makes a lot of intuitive sense. If we hold all else equal, in the next few videos we'll talk about what happens when we change some of those things that we're going to hold equal right now. But if you hold all else equal, and the only thing that you're doing is you're changing price, then the law of supply says that if the price goes up, I'll just say P for price, if the price goes up, then the supply, or let me be careful, the quantity supplied goes up. And then you can imagine if the price goes down, the quantity supplied goes down. And you might already notice that I was careful to say quantity supplied. And it's just like we saw with demand. When we talk about demand going up or down, we're talking about the entire price-quantity relationship shifting. When we talk about a particular quantity demanded, we say quantity demanded. We don't just say demand. This is the exact same thing for supply. When we're talking about a particular quantity, we'll be careful to say quantity. If we talk about supply increasing, we're talking about the entire relationship shifting, or either up or down. So let's just make sure that this makes intuitive sense for us, and I think it probably does. Let's think about ourselves as grape farmers, and I'll make a little supply schedule right over here. Supply, so grape supply schedule, which is really just a table showing the relationship between all else equal, the price and the quantity supplied. So let's label some scenarios over here, just like we did with the demand schedule. Scenarios, and then let's put our price over here. That's going to be in price. This will be in price per pound, the per pound price of grapes. And then this is the quantity produced over the time period. And whenever we do any of these supply or demand schedules, we're talking over a particular time period. It could be per day, it could be per month, it could be per year. But that's the only way to make some sense of, okay, what is the quantity per day going to be produced if that's the price? If we didn't say per day, we don't know what we're really talking about. Quantity supplied. And so let's just say scenario A, if the price per pound of grapes is 50 cents, if it's 50 cents per pound, actually let me just do round numbers, but you get the idea. If the price per pound is $1, let's just say for us, we consider that to be a relatively low price. And so we'll only kind of do the easiest land, our most fertile land, where it's easy to produce grapes, and maybe the fertile and cheap land. So no one else wants to use that land for other things. It's only good for growing grapes. And so we will provide, so this is price per pound, so per pound. And in that situation, we can produce 1,000 pounds in this year. And I've never been a grape farmer, so I actually don't know if that's a reasonable amount or not, but I'll just go with it, 1,000 pounds. Now, let's take scenario B. Let's say the price goes up to $2. Well, now, not only would we produce what we were producing before, but we might now want to maybe buy some more land that might have had other uses, land that's maybe not as productive for grapes, but we would, because now we can get more for grapes. And so maybe now we're willing to produce 2,000 pounds. 2,000 pounds. And we could keep going. The same dynamics keep happening. So let's say the price, if the price were $3 per pound. Now we do want to produce more. We'll maybe we're even willing to work a little harder, or plant things closer to each other, or maybe I'll get even more land involved that I would have otherwise used for other crops. And so then I'm going to produce 2,500 pounds. And I'll do one more scenario. Let's say scenario D, the price goes to $4 a pound. Same dynamic. I will stop planting other crops, use them now for grapes because grape prices are so high, and so I will produce 2,750 pounds. And so we can draw a supply curve just like we had drawn demand curves. So just like, and it's the same exact convention, which I'm not a fan of, putting price on the vertical axis, because as you see, we tend to talk about price as the independent variable. We don't always talk about it that way, and in most of math and science, a lot about independent variable on the horizontal axis. But the convention in economics is to
يا اخي انت الفزة صح الاول بعدين.
put it on the vertical axis. So price on the vertical axis, so then this is really price per pound, per pound. And then in the horizontal axis, quantity produced, or let me just write quantity produced, I'll say in the next year. We're assuming all of this is for the next year. So next year, and it's in thousands of pounds. So I'll put it in thousands of pounds. And so let's see, we go all the way from 1,000 to close to 3,000. So this is 1,000. That's 1 for 1,000. That's 2,000, and that is 3,000. And then the price goes all the way up to 4. So it's 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So we can just plot these points. These are specific points on the supply curve. So at $1, we would supply 1,000 pounds. At $1, 1,000 pounds. That's scenario A. At $2, we would supply 2,000 pounds. $2, we'd supply 2,000 pounds. That's scenario B. At $3, we'd supply 2,500 pounds. $3. Oh, sorry. I want to make. See, notice I get my axes confused. This is price. This is what we're kind of, when we talk about it this way, that we're kind of viewing the thing that's changing. Although you don't always have to view it that way. So at $1, 1,000 pounds. $1, 1,000 pounds. $2, 2,000 pounds. $2, 2,000 pounds. $3, not this isn't $3. This is $3. $3, 2,500 pounds. So right about there. That looks that's about 2,500. But I want to do that blue color so we don't get confused. So $3, 2,500 pounds. That's about right. So this is scenario C, and then scenario D at $4. Actually, let me be a little bit clearer with that. So this is 2,500 pounds. Gets us right over here. This is scenario C, and then scenario D at $4. $4, 2,750. So 2,750 is like right over there. So that is $4. That is scenario D. And if we connect them, they should all be on our supply curve. So they will all be, it will look something like that. And there's some minimum price. There's some minimum price we would need to supply some grapes at all. We wouldn't give them away for free, so maybe that's something, that minimum price is like over here, that just to even get started producing grapes. So this right over here is what our supply curve would look like. Now remember, the only thing we're varying here is the price. So if the price were to change, all else equal, we would move along this curve here. Now in the next few videos, I'll talk about all of those other things we've been holding equal and what they would do at any given price point to this curve, or in general, what they would do to the curve. In the last
لازم
video, we
عشان
introduced
جايب
ourselves
شيء.
to the law of supply,
شورت
and
واحد.
it was a fairly common
حاسك
sense
جايب
idea
شيء.
that if we hold all else equal, that if the price of something goes up, there's
السكر
more
فيه.
incentive for more producers to produce it, or a given producer to produce more of it. And we saw that as the price goes up, we moved along the supply curve, and the quantity produced went up. Now, what I want to talk about in this video is all of the things we held equal in the last video. And the first of these, I'll call this the price of inputs. Or another way to think about it is the cost of production. So if the price of inputs, maybe the price of labor, the people who would have to pick the grapes, or our fuel that we need to transport the grapes, or the land, if any of that increased, then at a given price point, we would make less money. There's less incentive for us to do it, especially if this is true only for grapes. Maybe we'll say, okay, if it's now more expensive to get grape seeds, maybe I'll start planting something else because I'm not getting as much profit per pound of grape. So if the price of my inputs, or if the price of my cost, or if the size of my costs go up, at any given price point, I'd want to produce less. So if my the price of inputs go up, my supply, the supply would go down. So if this becomes at this price point, I'd make less money, so I would produce less, or maybe I would produce other things. So this would the whole supply curve would shift to the left. And also even the minimum price I would need to supply any of it would also go up when you shift the curve to the left, because now all of a sudden it costs me more to produce even that first unit. And likewise, if my price of my inputs went down, now all of a sudden at any given price point, producing grapes would become more profitable, and I would have more incentive to maybe produce grapes relative to other things and use more land for grapes than other things, and then you would have the whole curve shift to the right. Now let's think about related goods. So what happens with the price of related goods? And we have to put when we think about this, we don't want to think of it from a demand point of view, because we're talking about supply. You want to think about it from the producer's point of view. So when we think about related goods here, we want to think about substitutes for production. So maybe I'm a farmer, and I know very little bit about farming, so I don't know if this is possible. But maybe on my land, I'm saying, well, some of my land is going to be for grapes, and some of it is going to be for blueberries. And so what would happen if the price of a related good, in particular blueberries, what would happen if the price of blueberries went up? Well, if the price of blueberries went up, then I would say, wow, maybe I can do better with blueberries, and I would allocate more of my land to blueberries than to grapes. And so once again, if the price of related goods, it depends which related goods, but if the price of productive substitutes, so price of other things I could produce, if the price of other things I can produce goes up, then my supply of grapes, once again, my supply of grapes would go down. And the important thing is in any of these circumstances, literally just think it through. Do not just look at what I'm writing here and just try to memorize in some form, way, shape, or form. This is really just a way to think about things. Hey, if I can make more money off of blueberries now, all of a sudden I'm going to allocate more of my land to blueberries than to grapes. Supply of grapes will go down. Now let's think about what happens with the number of suppliers. And this is pretty common sense. The more people they are supplying, the higher the supply would be. So if the number of suppliers goes up, and now you wouldn't imagine, this is a curve maybe for the aggregate supply. So if the number of suppliers go up, then the aggregate supply would go up at any given price point. If the number of suppliers were to go down, then the aggregate supply would go down at any given price point. So this one hopefully is somewhat obvious. Then we can think about things like technology. And so this is just maybe there's some innovation, some new type of seed that with the same amount of work, the same amount of land, can produce that many more grapes. So if we have technological improvements, I'm assuming we're not going to go into some type of dark ages. If we have technological improvements, then that will also make the supply that will also make the supply go up. You can also think of it as it might make it cheaper to produce. So it's kind of the same thing here. The price of inputs might go down. So that would make your supply go up. Or you could just say, hey, look, there's just going to be more grapes popping off of these new types of vines that we got. So we're just going to produce more grapes. And then the last one I'll cover, and it's a little bit strange in the grape analogy, is the expected future prices. So the expected future prices. Expected future prices, price expectations. And let's go away from the grapes, because grapes they're perishable goods. They go bad. It's not like you can save goods to produce to use them later. But if, let's say, you are an oil producer, and oil is something that you can store and you can use it later. If you expected oil prices, if you expected oil prices to be neutral today, and then tomorrow, all of a sudden, you are sure that oil prices are going to go up in the future. You're sure that a year from now, oil prices are just going to go through the roof. What's your incentive? Well, you should hoard all of your oil. Do not sell it today and wait to sell it in the future if you're sure that's what's going to happen. So if you if there's a change in expected future prices, so if you go from neutral to expecting prices go up in the future, then you're going to hoard your goods. You can't hoard grapes because the grapes will just go bad. You might be able to, I don't know, turn them into wine or something. But if we're talking about something like oil, you would say, hey, why should I pump all of the fixed amount of oil in the ground today to sell it at today's lower prices? I'm going to lower the supply today, and so I can sell it in the future. So if the expected future prices go from you're neutral to you expect future prices to go up dramatically, then current supply, and I'm just going to emphasize by writing the word current supply will go down, so you can hoard it to sell it in the future. So let's say we are in the Apple market. What I want to do in this video is think about both demand and supply for the apples at different prices. Let's draw ourselves a little graph here. And we already know this right over here. The vertical axis is the price axis, and we're going to say it's price per pound. And the horizontal axis, this is the quantity of apples. And let's put some tick marks here. Let's say that's $1 a pound, $2 a pound, $3 a pound, $4 a pound, and $5. And let's say that this is thousands of pounds produced, and we have to set a period. So let's say this is all for the next week. And so this is 1,000 pounds, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and 5,000. Now let's think about both the supply and the demand curves for this market, or potential supply and demand curves. So first I will do the demand. So if the price of apples were really high, and I encourage you to always think about this when you're about to draw your demand and supply curves. If the price of apples were really high, what would happen to consumers? Well, they wouldn't demand much. So the quantity demanded would be low. So if the price were high, maybe the quantity demanded.
يا شباب شو معناتها كلمة inferior goods؟
I don't know.
أيوة inferior goods. هلا normal goods هي الجودز إذا ارتفع الانكم تبع الشعب، إذا ارتفعوا الرواتب بيرتفع الديماند عليهم، بيرتفع الناس تشتري أكتر منهم. الانفيريور جودز الشغلات مثل مثلا السيارات العتيقة، إذا ارتفع الرواتب ما بعود حدا بيشتري السيارات العتيقة، لأن كل الناس بتعود تشتري سيارات جديدة. السيارات العتيقة هي inferior goods. إذا ارتفعوا الرواتب بينقص الديماند عليهم، بينقص الطلب.
تمام.
هلا أنت تعرف term in economic.
تمام، أنا لكن رايح هلا أسوي متى مشان أعرف أكتر بهي اللي عم تقول عنها أنت.
والله ذبحتني وأنا بدي أسوي متى. يلا برب.
والله متى شوفت. ليش نو برايم يا شباب؟ ليه نو برايم؟ ليه؟ مشان الملائكة ليش؟ والله ما نفوز لو الله ينزل. ليه نو برايم يا خيارة؟ الو ولا عاد حدا يرد.
Mitsubi and tunnel. Maybe T-spawn. Nice. 1B. Go HB.
تمام
Tunnel.
دور.
And it is like 500 apples. 500 apples. And once again, I'm being very careful to say the quantity demanded is 500 apples. I'm not saying the demand is 500 apples. The demand is the entire relationship. The actual specific quantity, we call that the quantity demanded. So at a price of $5, the quantity demanded would be about 500. Maybe at a price of $1, the quantity demanded would be maybe 4,000 pounds. And so our demand curve might look something like this. Might look something like that. We've got a little bit less bumpy. So our demand curve might look something like that. I can label it. That is our demand curve. And now let's think about our supply curve. Well, there's some price below which we aren't even willing to produce apples. So let's say that's like 50 cents. So at 50 cents, that's where we're even just willing to start producing apples. Let's say if the price of apples got to $1, the quantity we'd be willing to supply is about 1,000 pounds. And it just keeps increasing as the price increases. So this is the supply curve. And when I talk about we, I'm talking about all of the suppliers in this market. We could be doing this for a specific supplier. We could be doing this for a specific market. We could be doing this for the global Apple market, however you want to view it. But for the sake of this video, let's assume it's like our little town that is fairly isolated and all of that. Now let's think about what happens in different scenarios.
والله.
What happens if the suppliers of the apples going into that week for their own planning purposes, they just think for whatever reason that they're only going to be able to sell the apples at $1 per pound, and so given this supply curve, they only supply 1,000 pounds. So this is what the suppliers plan for, and this is where they set the price point at $1, at $1 per pound. Now, what's going to happen in that scenario? Well, in that scenario, they supplied 1,000. The quantity supplied is 1,000 pounds. So let me write this down. So I'll do pink for this scenario. So in this scenario, the quantity supplied. Supplied is 1,000 pounds. And what is the quantity demanded? Quantity demanded. Demanded. And this is all a scenario where the price or the initial price that the growers or the producer set was $1 per pound.
Okay.
$1 per pound. Well, the quantity demanded at $1 per pound is 4,000 pounds of apples. 4,000 pounds of apples. So what do we have here? Well, here we have a shortage. We have a shortage of 3,000 apples at that price point. At $1, a lot more people are going to want to buy apples, and the producers just didn't. I guess they didn't figure that out right, and they didn't produce enough apples. Now, what will naturally start happening? If you have the shortage, you have all these people who want to buy apples, and you only have so many apples there. What might happen in the next period, in the next week? Well, first of all, those apples that are out there, they might get bid up, so the price is going to start going up. The price is going to start going up. People are going to start bidding up the apples. They want them so badly, they're going to start bidding them up. And as they start getting bid up, the producers are going to say, wow, there's so many people, we're running out of apples. We also need to increase the quantity produced. And so the quantity will also go up. So the price will go up. If you look at from the supplier's point of view, the price will go up and the quantity will go up. They will move along this line there. So maybe in the next period there's less of a shortage, or they get slow. They move away from that shortage situation. If the price and quantity increase a little bit, so maybe the price goes to $2, and the quantity goes to, I don't know, this looks like about 1,900 pounds. Now all of a sudden you have less of a shortage. And I think you see that I'm getting to an interesting point over here. But I won't go there just yet. Now let's think about another situation. Let's think about after this happens, price and quantity increases so much that it essentially overshoots this interesting point right over here. So in the next week, the suppliers all say, wow, people want our apples so badly. Let's set the price really high at $3. And at $3, we're really excited about producing apples. So we, the suppliers, are going to produce, let me do this in a color I haven't used yet. We, the suppliers, are going to produce at $3 a pound. We're hoping to sell 3,000 pounds of apples. So this is where they adjust to the next week. But what's going to happen there at a price of $3? So that's this scenario right over here. Price of $3. So the price is now $3 per pound. Well, now the quantity supplied is going to be 3,000 pounds. 3,000 pounds. I could write 3,000 pounds. And what is the quantity demanded? The quantity demanded is now much lower. The price is high now because consumers might want to go buy other things, or they can't afford an apple, or whatever it might be. And so now the quantity demanded, that looks like about, I don't know, 1,300 pounds. 1,300 pounds. So what situation do we have now? Well, now we have a much bigger supply or the quantity supplied is much bigger than the quantity demanded. So now we face a surplus. So now we have a surplus. Let me not draw that line there. I want to make it clear this is all the same scenario. We now have a surplus of, what is this? 700 will get us to 2,000. We have a surplus of 1,700
هذا اللي معك
pounds
مثل
of
البطات
apples.
ويجيب كلها.
And now what happens in a surplus situation?
سحر.
Well, apples won't stay good forever, so maybe the producers get a little desperate, so they start selling, they start reducing the price, maybe to start attracting some consumers, so they start reducing the price. And also when they start seeing that the price is going down and you have this glut of apples and that they're all going bad and they're not getting sold, the quantity is also going to start going down. They'll produce fewer and fewer apples. And so we'll move here. We'll move here along the supply curve. And as you decrease the price, what's going to happen to the demand curve? Well, the demand is going to go up. So over here, the price was too high. So it's natural for the sellers to lower the price. And so when you lower the price, it also reduces the quantity. We go this way. And when you lower the price, it increases demand. You go that way. If the price to get from the get-go were too low, then you have this huge shortage. Things get bid up. The prices go up. As the price goes up, the suppliers want to produce more. They move up the curve. And as the price goes up, then the people will demand less. And you see that it's all converging on a point right over here where the two lines intersect. And let me do that it's all converging right over there. And that's the point at which that's the price at which, this is the price at which the quantity supplied will equal the quantity demanded. And we call this price, which looks like for this scenario, maybe about $2.15. So let me just write it there. So $2.15, we call that the equilibrium price. Equilibrium price is $2.15 a pound. And it's the price at which the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And so this quantity where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, that's the equilibrium quantity. Equilibrium quantity. And that right over here looks like it's right about, I don't know, 2,200 pounds. 2,200 pounds. And assuming nothing else changes, this is a good scenario for both the consumers and the producers. They keep producing 2,200, they charge this price, and everything's happy. All the apples get sold, and none of them go bad. What I want to do in this video is think about how supply and or demand might change based on changes in some factors in the market. And then think about what that might do to the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So let's say at some period, this is what the supply curve looks like, and this is what the demand curve looks like. And then all of a sudden, this thing happens. A new disease-resistant apple is invented. What's likely to happen for the next period? Well, a new disease-resistant apple being invented, this is something that clearly impacts the growers, clearly impacts the suppliers. All of a sudden, they'll have fewer apples succumbing to disease, and so they will be able to produce more apples. So at any given price point, this will shift the quantity supplied up. So at any given price point, it will shift the quantity of apples supplied up, or you could say that the entire supply curve is shifted to the right, or supply goes up. And let me draw the entire curve. And obviously, if now we have disease-resistant apples, even our minimum price to start producing apples is lower. Now, when we had the supply curve shift in this way, when it shifted to the right, what happens to the equilibrium price? Well, our old equilibrium price was right over here. Our new equilibrium price, so this is the old one, and this is our new equilibrium price. We're assuming that demand has not changed at all. So this is our new equilibrium price. So our new equilibrium price is lower. So the price went down. And you don't have to. You could have probably reasoned through that before taking an econ class. But this way, at least you have some way to think about it and think about how the curves are changing. Now let's think about this scenario. So this is before. So in all of these examples, the graph is what happened before the news came out or the event came out. So this is before. And then a study is released on how apples prevent cancer. So what is that likely to do? Well, no one wants cancer. And so more people are going to be eager to have apples. This will change customer preferences. They will prefer apples even more when they're at the supermarket. So this is clearly affecting demand, customer preferences. And so at a given price, people will want they will demand a higher quantity of apples. The quantity of apples demanded at a given price will go up. So the demand curve will shift to the right. Or you could say that demand would go up. So that's the new demand curve. So here, demand goes up. Demand goes up. And let me write over here. In this situation, supply went up. Here, demand goes up. And what happens to the price? Well, this is our old equilibrium price. This is our new equilibrium price. The price clearly went up. So the price went up. And actually over here, let's think about the quantity too in this first situation. This is our old equilibrium quantity. This is our new equilibrium quantity. Quantity went up, which makes sense. You have fewer apples dying, price went down, more people want to buy them. Here, price went up, and what happened to quantity? What happened to quantity? Quantity, this was our old equilibrium quantity. This is our new equilibrium quantity. Quantity also went up. Quantity also went up. More people just want to buy apples. They don't want to get cancer. Now let's think about these scenarios right over here. The pear cider industry launches an ad campaign. And for the sake of this, let's assume that the same growers who grow apples can also grow pears. That makes it interesting. So you have a couple of interesting things. By launching this advertising campaign, we'll assume it's a good advertising campaign. This clearly will make demand go up it'll make demand go up for cider, for pear cider relative to apple cider. Most people, when they think of cider, they think of apple cider. Now all of a sudden pear cider comes out. It'll make demand for apple cider go down. So this is apple cider demand will go down. Now, if apple cider demand goes down, the apple cider producers are going to demand fewer apples. So this is going to mean that apple demand will go down. At any given price point, apple demand will go down. So apple demand, the demand curve will shift to the left. Or I should say, at any given price point, the quantity demanded will go down. And so the entire demand curve, the entire relationship will shift to the left. Will shift to the left. Now, that's not all that might happen. Because if you think about it from the supplier's point of view, and I don't know if this really is the case, but let's assume that the farmers who grow apples can also grow pears. Well, they might say, well, why, now that there's more demand for pears, they're doing this advertising campaign, I want to, and probably the price of pears has gone up, they might say, well, I'm going to devote more of my land to pears and less of my land to apples. And so the supply of apples, so apple supply, I want to be clear here that we're talking about apple, the apple supply might go down. So it will also shift to the left. So they're both shifting to the left. They're both shifting to the left. Now, what is likely to happen here? So the demand went down and the supply went down. They both shifted to the left. Well, here, the way I drew it, this was our old equilibrium price. This is our new equilibrium price. It actually looks the way that I drew it right over here, that it did not change. The equilibrium quantity definitely did change. So let's see. This is our old equilibrium quantity. This is our new equilibrium quantity. This clearly, the quantity went down. It was a bad day for apples, but the price didn't change because, at least in the example, we assume that the farmers actually also produced fewer apples. It turns out, I could have drawn this in multiple ways. And actually, let me draw it in different ways here. So the quantity definitely, so let's think about other scenarios. Let me draw it slightly different. Let's say that the supply goes down even more dramatically. So let's say the supply shifts all the way. The supply shifts really far back. Now what happens? Well, now our equilibrium price, because the reduction in supply was kind of more extreme than the reduction in demand. Now, and it really depends on how the curve shapes and all of that. The main thing is to reason through it or to actually see what the actual results are. But in this situation, all of a sudden that the price went up, but the quantity definitely still went down. So in this case, the one thing that you're always going to be sure of is that the quantity will go down, but the price went up because this effect, the supply went down much more than the demand did, and so the price went up. Now I could have done another scenario. Where maybe the supply barely budged, or maybe the demand went down dramatically. Let me do it where the supply barely budges. So if maybe the supply, it only gets shifted a little bit to the left. So maybe the supply curve looks like this. Now all of a sudden, once again, quantity definitely goes down. So in all of the scenarios, the quantity will go down. But I've just done 3 scenarios where the price could be neutral, the price could go up, or the price could go down. So you actually don't know what is going to happen to the price based on this. You would actually have to look at the actual curve and see what the new equilibrium prices are. Now let's look at this one. The apple pickers unionize demand, and they demand wage increases. So this is an issue for the suppliers. So all of a sudden, one of their inputs, one of their costs of production, which is labor, has gone up. So if their cost of production has gone up, now at a given price point, they are less profitable, less willing to produce apples. So at a given price point, so we're talking about the suppliers, at a given price point, they will supply a lower quantity. They will supply a lower quantity. So this is going to lower supply. This is going to lower supply. And when you lower supply, what's going to happen? Well, your equilibrium quantity, this was our old one, this is our new one. Equilibrium quantity definitely goes down. The quantity went down. And what happened to the price? We're assuming nothing changes to the demand. So this was our old equilibrium price. This is our new equilibrium price. It went up. Quantity went down and price went up. I encourage you to, I should have told you this at the beginning, so you should have tried to do these yourself and then see what I had to say about them. But I encourage you to try this out with different situations. Think of situations yourself and even think about different markets other than the Apple market.
Tiny grain of affection from a warm-hearted.
Hello, welcome to video 7, which is about the price mechanism. This phenomenon of demand and supply coming together in a market and deciding what will be the price and what will be the quantity. It's a real fundamental in economics, and it's at the basis of all allocation of resources in free markets. The price mechanism, the market mechanism, market forces, you might even call it the invisible hand, which is a phrase that Adam Smith used in 1776 in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Whatever you call it, it's something you have to understand what it is and how it's operating in markets. So let's start with the definition. The price or market mechanism is the phenomenon of the interaction of the market forces of demand and supply to reach an equilibrium price and quantity in a market such that any and all demand is satisfied and all supply is sold. In this way, the best allocation of limited resources is achieved. That's the definition. Let's think about this question to show you how the market mechanism operates. How many shoe shops are there in London? Who knows? Certainly more than 5, and certainly less than 100,000. But there must be some exact number at this moment in time of, say, shoe shops in, say, London. But no one decided that. There isn't some government committee that said there must be 4,000 shoe shops in London, no more, no less. No, it was the market mechanism that decided that Londoners and people visiting London require that many shoe shops. Let's imagine we did this and we could search out and research and find out that there were in fact 4,000 shoe shops in London. That must be a product of the demand for shoes in London, such that 4,000 individual entrepreneurs decided, whether they're part of a large chain of shoe shops or whether they're individuals, to put together some land, some labour and some capital, some limited factors of production, put them together, pay for those factors of production and provide, supply shoes for the public. Perhaps there were less than 4,000 originally, and there was so much demand that it alerted, it sent signals to other suppliers to stop doing whatever they were doing and go into the shoe shop market. Or perhaps there were too many shoe shops and some simply couldn't get enough business to justify their employment of land, labour and capital, to pay for the land, labour and capital. They didn't get enough revenue and they closed down. And it was the demand for shoes, interacting with the suppliers of shoes, which took the market to an equilibrium position such that there were 4,000 shoe shops in London. That might rise, that might fall, according to changes in demand and supply. But the figure, whatever it is, say 4,000 that was reached, was a product of the price mechanism. So, the price mechanism provides signals to buyers and sellers who can respond to shocks and changes that lead to an efficient reallocation of limited resources. When demand or supply changes, it is the market mechanism that alerts the demanders and the suppliers of what's changed and leads the market to the new best allocation of resources. It might be more, it might be less. We'll look at an example in a minute. The price mechanism allows new equilibrium prices and quantities to be reached when some variable changes, and it's happening constantly. It's happening all the time. But let's look at one simple example. Here we have the market for fur coats, and here we have the market for plastic coats. Both the markets are in equilibrium, and they both have an equilibrium price of P1 and a quantity of Q1 in their respective markets. Now something changes. Perhaps it's a demand side factor, perhaps it's a supply side factor, but something changes, and that leads to the reallocation through the price mechanism of resources in this small economy. Let's imagine that people's awareness of animal rights and the way animals are treated is heightened in some way. Perhaps a television documentary shocks the country and the public as to how animals for fur coats are treated in animal fur coat farms or wherever this fur comes from. And that has an effect on the demand for fur coats, and of course it would reduce the demand for fur coats as people's awareness of the rights of such animals is heightened. And we can show that, of course, by a fall in demand. So demand would shift downwards to D2. The price mechanism takes us to a new equilibrium point here, and we have a new price, P2, and a new quantity, Q2. However, there's likely to be a knock-on effect in another market, let's say the market for plastic coats. Some people needing coats are no longer willing to buy fur coats. That's what's happened in the fur coat market, and the demand has fallen, and the price has fallen, and the quantity has fallen. Those people may instead wish to buy plastic coats rather than fur coats. So we're likely to see in this market, the plastic coat market, a rise in demand, because plastic coats are acting as a substitute for fur coats. And that raises the price, and that raises the quantity supplied to Q2. What's happened is that some of the limited resources in the economy have been reallocated out of fur coats and into plastic coats. Now stop and think what that means. It literally means, as the demand for fur coats fell, suppliers of fur coats got the signal that demand was falling and chose to supply a lower quantity, fewer fur coats to the market. We see that with the drop of quantity supplied. When the price fell, that was the signal to suppliers of fur coats to reduce the quantity they're supplying. But what does that mean, to reduce the quantity of fur coats they're supplying? It does, of course, mean that they reduce the quantity of factors of production employed in this industry. So some factors of production were freed up because they were no longer needed, because fewer fur coats were being made. Well, that means literally that land, labour and capital in the fur coat industry, being employed in that fur coat industry, was reduced. And this means, of course, that some workers were made redundant from the fur coat industry, and some land was no longer used, perhaps a factory where they made these fur coats, perhaps one of the farms where they have these animals for their fur closed down. Land, labour and capital was freed up. But in this industry, plastic coats, land, labour and capital was increased. More land, labour and capital was used in the plastic coat industry. In a very simple example, perhaps the very people who were made redundant in the fur coat industry received employment in the plastic coat industry. Perhaps a fur coat factory closed down and reopened as a plastic coat factory. So the land, the labour and the capital gets reallocated across the industries. And that's the price mechanism reacting to falls in demand and rises in demand. And it could happen with changes in supply as well. I want you to see the reallocation through the price mechanism, the signals were sent. Let's look at a slightly more complicated example, just to show you that it isn't limited to just two industries. Let's start with the market for fresh fish. Now, I've linked the market for fresh fish to various markets. And let's see what happens in the market for fresh fish. Imagine this. Imagine that fish farmers, because I want to show a supply side event now, fish farmers are faced with restricted laws to protect fresh fish in the seas and the oceans. The fishermen are faced with new laws which make it more difficult for them to catch fish. I don't know what it means, special new nets, or maybe they're just not allowed to catch as many fish. So in some way they're restricted. This is going to raise the costs of production for the fish farmers. And we show that with an inward shift of the supply curve, raising the costs of production. So S1 shifts to S2. And it raises price. That's the new price from P1, goes up to P2, and it reduces the quantity of fresh fish. The signal, thanks to the market mechanism, the signal has been sent in the fish market that the cost of production have risen. This raises the price, and that's a signal to people who buy fish, the demanders, and they reduce their quantity demanded. We're moving along the demand curve from there to there, reducing the quantity demanded. But that, through the price mechanism, the signal of higher fish prices leads to those people who were buying fish to perhaps buy something else now, a substitute for fish. Now that might be beef. So perhaps the beef industry sees a rise in the quantity demanded, but that's a signal to beef farmers to increase the quantity supplied of beef. And it raises the price of beef as well. That might have an effect on the mustard market. If people are buying more beef, well, they'll buy more mustard as well, because mustard goes very nicely with beef. It's a complement. They're in joint demand. And that increases the demand for mustard. And so that's a signal to the market for mustard, for the suppliers to increase their quantity. That goes out to Q2 and the price of mustard goes up. All because fishermen had higher costs of production. And meanwhile, in other markets, there might be an increase in the demand for chicken, sending a signal to chicken farmers to increase their quantity supplied. In the market for fishing boats, which of course are produced by somebody, well, there's going to be less demand for fishing boats because fewer fishermen have work. And in the market for potatoes, for fish and chips, there might be less demand for potatoes. So you see that it happens across lots of different markets, and even these markets then have a reaction to other markets, and so on and so on. And these ripples ripple outwards across the economy. When something happens in the market, in one market, it sends ripples out across other markets. And that's the price mechanism, sending signals to the suppliers and demanders across many different markets as they reallocate resources. Fewer fishermen here, but more workers needed in the beef industry, and more workers needed in the mustard industry. So maybe labour will get reallocated out of the fishing industry and out of the fish boat building industry and into other industries like beef farming and chicken farming and mustard farming. And maybe workers will lose their jobs in the potato industry, but they will pick up maybe work in other areas. So you see, the price mechanism is informing buyers and sellers constantly about changes in markets, and it leads to the reallocation of our limited resources.
هلا عرفت.
But who decides these allocations of resources? Nobody. It's no planning committee. It's no government committee. In the free market mechanism, no individual group of people are deciding this, and yet, in a way, everybody is deciding. As consumers and producers, we are all reacting to the signals of changing price and deciding whether, as consumers, whether we will or won't buy more or less, and as producers, whether we should go ahead and produce more or produce less and re-employ the limited resources in another way. So there we are, that's the price mechanism. Deciding the allocation of resources and also reallocating resources constantly to find new prices and quantities as a result of changes that are happening all the time in many markets and in markets connected to markets. Okay? Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.
طفى الفيديو. إذا ما عرفت تفتح عندي
Someone's watching, now they're not. NordVPN from $275 a month.
User joined your channel.
يا فهد الحنبلة.
What the fuck are you, Syrian piece of shit?
Hello, welcome to video number 8. This is all about consumer surplus and producer surplus. These are two concepts which are pretty straightforward. They're not too difficult, but we have to cover them. So I've put them together in this video to complete this week's videos. Right, so let's have a look at them. Consumer surplus and producer surplus. Let's start with consumer surplus. Let's define it first of all. Consumer surplus is the difference between the price consumers are prepared to pay for a product and the market price. And on a diagram, we can find consumer surplus because it is an area surrounded by the price axis, the price level, and the demand curve. Let's go back to this. It's the difference between the price consumers are prepared to pay and the market price. Think about the last thing that you bought. Let's assume that the last thing you bought was a sandwich at lunchtime, if you're watching this in the afternoon. A sandwich at lunchtime. Let's say that you bought a cheese sandwich and it cost you, let's say you're in the UK, it cost you £2. Well, you decided it was worth it. You were hungry enough and there was few enough other items for sale, other places to go, and you had enough money in your pocket and you thought, yes, I'll pay £2 for a cheese sandwich, and you bought your cheese sandwich. Perhaps you were prepared to pay more than £2. Ask yourself, it's highly unlikely that the last thing you bought was priced at a price where you were not prepared to go any higher. If you did buy a cheese sandwich for £2, I'm sure you would have been prepared to pay £2.10 for it, or maybe £3 or £5. Seriously, ask yourself, what was the last thing you bought? What did you pay for it? And would you have paid more had it been slightly more expensive? If you were prepared to pay more, if you were prepared to pay £2.50 for the cheese sandwich, you had consumer surplus. It wasn't possible for the seller, the cafe or the sandwich bar, to be able to get inside your mind and know precisely how much you were prepared to pay. They would love to do that, because if they could squeeze more money out of you, of course they would do that. But they don't know that, so they have to go with their equilibrium price. Most of the time we do have consumer surplus, because most of the time when we buy things we were prepared to pay more, perhaps a lot more, certainly a little bit more. If we're not prepared to pay the price, if £2 was too much to pay for a cheese sandwich, you simply don't buy it. You don't have to buy it. So there must be very few people who, when they buy a product, they find it is precisely the price that they were willing to go up to, but no more. That's a bit unlikely. Now, there is one case where the seller is perhaps able to take the buyer right up to their maximum price, and that's in an auction. So if you're in an auction and you're bidding for a good, it's a way for the seller, who's only selling one item in an auction, to be able to locate which of the people in the bidding room, in the auction room, which person is actually prepared to pay the highest price. Because amongst themselves, they outbid each other until one is left. That was the person who was prepared to pay the highest price. But even with that person, we don't know how high they were willing to go. We only know they're willing to go a bit higher than the second person. Nevertheless, it is a good way of trying to get rid of consumer surplus by auctioning an item. That's not going to happen in a sandwich bar, is it? Or in a supermarket, or on all the other places we spend our money. So consumer surplus exists. It's the difference between what a consumer is prepared to pay for a good and the price they have to pay, the market price. And for all the consumers of a product, it's the combined differences between what each individual was prepared to pay and the market price. And as this says here, we can see consumer surplus on a diagram. Let's have a look at a diagram. Here's a diagram, market good, we have an equilibrium price, P1, quantity Q1. But we know that were the price to be higher, let's say the price was here, P2, well, there would still be some demand. This much would be sold. Not as much. Some people would have dropped out of the market, but plenty would still be sold. So there must be people in this market with consumer surplus, because we can see that were the price a little higher, there are still people prepared to pay for the product. But they don't have to pay a higher price. The price is P1. Well, if we add up all of the consumer surplus, we find that it's this area here. It is the area surrounded by the price axis, the price level, and the demand curve. And it's this area here. Okay? That's consumer surplus. How that can change, we'll come to in a minute. But let's now switch to producer surplus. Producer surplus is the difference between the price suppliers are willing to supply at and the market price. Now, people do get a little confused with this definition. You have to be precise with the definition. It's the difference between the price suppliers were willing to supply at and the market price. That sandwich shop was selling cheese sandwiches at £2. But perhaps if somehow the cheese sandwich price was to fall to £1.50, perhaps the sandwich bar would still be willing to make cheese sandwiches and sell them for £1.50. They're very happy that the price is higher, it's £2. They would be said to have producer surplus. You see, different suppliers are willing to supply products at different prices. You might run a sandwich bar and you might say, yes, I can buy bread and I can buy the services of a worker and I can buy cheese and I can pay for electricity and I can buy some cutting knives and spreading butter and I'll pay rent and I can make it all work and I can sell cheese sandwiches if the price is £1.50. I hope the price is higher, but if the price is £1.50 I can do it. Whereas I might run a sandwich bar less efficiently and I might say, no, I can't make it work. I'm not prepared to supply cheese sandwiches at £1.50. I will if it's £2. But at £1.50 I can't make a profit. So I'm not willing to do it. You see, different suppliers will see different ways of employing factors of production and will find different costs.
يا جاي.
اوكي بتحكي شي قبل ما اعطاميك بان؟
سلامتك.
لا بتحكي شي قبل ما اعطاميك بان؟
لا سلامتك.
لا في شي احكي. بعدين انا جاي انت شو دخلك؟
انا ما عم اقول لك شيء. انت ليش انزعجت؟ طيب اذا انت جاي ليش انزعجت اذا قلت لك جاي؟
انا ما عم بحكي على الجاي. ايه انا جاي انت شو دخلك؟ انا هيك حار خيا مبسوط انت شو دخلك؟
انا ما قلت لك شيء. شو حكيت لك؟ سبيتك انا؟ انت جاي قلت لك جاي.
لا حبيبي طريقة حكيك الاكسنت
يعني
تبعيتك.
شو لازم اقول لك اياها؟ اقول لك اياها ب شو اسمه يعني؟ اقول لك اياها بهيك بحب وحنان.
User was kicked out of your channel. User was moved to your
يعني
channel.
قال لك اياها بحبه حنان.
طيب ماشي عيدة.
الله يسامحك. انت يا حبيب قلبي، انت يا حبيب قلبي واحد جه منيح هيك.
طيب ماشي غيره.
ما في شي عم انت. طيب قلت لي عيدها شو؟
طيب المطلوب.
ما مطلوب شي. اتفق.
يا زلمة ليش علقت الشيفت تاب؟ علقت الشيفت تاب قلب الفيديو على فيديو تاني، والفيديو التاني صوته عالي وما عم بحسن اوطي الصوت.
شوف ايمن يلعب.
ها؟
شوف ايمن يلعب.
انا العب انا فهد.
لو
مين؟
مو مشكلة. شوف ايمن خلص.
لو بده يلعب كان فتح تيم سبيك. شفته هون. لو لعب تمطر برا. واخ يا زلمة صلي من نوفمبر ما مطرت عنا. يلا فهد تعال عملت لك انفايت.
يلا بس عم بسوي نجيب.
يا زلمة صرع وراسي. صار لي ساعة بس عم بدرس على إذا سعر التفاح ارتفع، وإذا الناس أكلت تفاح كثير، وإذا الناس أكلت تفاح قليل،
يا عمي شو بدك هيك حكيت حكي فاضي.
وإذا أجا طقس حلو قام صار في تفاحة كتير بالسوق، شو بيصير؟
بتزرقن وحده واحده فيه.
وإذا معلم إذا الدولة عملت مساعدة للفلاحين شو بيأثر على الماركت؟ وجع راسي يا زلمة.
Hi everybody, market failure occurs where the free market fails to allocate scarce resources. Hi everybody, with exam. Hi everybody, this is going to be a really useful video to give you a guide of how to revise for your economics exams using Econ Plus Style, the channel on YouTube. The channel homepage, guys, has everything you need on it and it's all nicely laid out. I've made sure that all the videos there, all the playlists are beautifully laid out so you can basically go there and find everything you need to revise effectively for your final exams. I love to use playlists, and if you look down my channel homepage, you'll find absolutely everything you need in playlist form, and it's all there to match your spec. If we look through here, you can see.
يا شباب be right back. أنا بدي أدخل الحمام.
We have year 1 and year 2 macro playlists, very nicely laid out for you. You have year 1 and year 2 micro playlists, lovely laid out for you, so you can watch everything you need and get your notes from those videos very clearly. But you can also see for you year 2 economists that the extras that you need, such as labor markets, financial markets, development economics, and behavioral economics, all have their own separate playlists here. So you'll need to watch those videos and make sure all that content is perfectly covered. Anytime, guys, you want to look for more specific videos, so you don't want to go through an entire playlist, you just want to find one specific video that you want to watch. For example, you want to know about quantitative easing, let's say, then use the channel search button, again found on the channel homepage. Click on that, type in the title of the video that you're looking at. Pretty much every exam technique that you need is covered. For every question, yes, but also my tips, my guidance, common mistakes, all kinds of things you'll find in writing and judgment diagrams very well. These videos will cover that for you, so worth giving these videos a watch as well. These are very short videos, to the point videos, but very useful to make sure you go 2008 are good to keep every time that you're revising, and make sure that you're watching videos that clearly are linked to your exam board. Following the playlists on the homepage will be absolutely brilliant. The homepage of Econ Style needs to be the go-to place where you go for revision, where you watch videos. You will get everything you need from the homepage. Remember that. Don't need to go anywhere else on my channel. And like I said, if you're looking for something more targeted, use the search button on the homepage. Hi everybody, your microeconomics exam is coming up in a few days' time and you need application to get those A's and A stars. The examiner will expect it from you guys. No matter what the question is, they will want application. And if you don't have extract data there to help you, what are you going to do? Well, this video is going to give you absolutely everything that you need. For every topic area in the course, I'm going to provide you application. A huge amount of work and effort has gone into making this video because I know how difficult it is to do it on your own. So make sure you take everything down and you memorize all of this stuff to use in your essays. Now bear in mind, I'm not going to go into huge detail with these examples because otherwise the video will be too long. So you can go and research if you want more depth to use in your essays, but this is very, very, very powerful stuff. Write everything down from start to end. Let's start by looking at markets and all the stuff around markets. When it comes to the basic economic problem, you're looking at scarcity. Water scarcity in India and China, big issue. You've also got food scarcity issues around the world, great to use in your essays. Demand shift right, let's look at all these curves, demand, supply and shifting both ways. For demand shifting right, UK housing, low interest rates you can talk about, higher price of a substitute like rent, for example, higher incomes in the UK. Coffee and makeup, these markets in India, big.
شو؟
عم بيحسن فوت.
عمل لي انفايت.
فوت يا حبيبي.
علوا صوتكم شوي انا اذا ما رديت عليكم لاني هذا.
failed to join season. Please try again later.
Season? Season? ايش السيزن؟ صيف ولا شتاء؟
سيزن. حسطيزي. تل حسطيزي. لك تل حسطيزي.
شو السيزن بالله عندكم صيف ولا شتاء؟
ها يلا يا حبيب.
بدك تشيت منيح يا مصاصة.
هاي انا خالص جبت جهاز.
عاد بدك تشيت.
انسى انا شفتني في شغل شيت قص رجلي عفست.
لا روح شغل هلا اخي الكريم روح.
جبت عندي فيه هلا الامر لسه شغال عندي والله والامر يعني هلا صاير منيح مو كل هالقد كخه.
اسمع شو بدي احكي لك؟
او ماي جاد اتش بي كي فان بوي.
اي حاط لك صورة شو رايك اشتك احلى من هيك؟
سكيت ما تجيب وشو اسمه اذا بدك تشيت منيح روح على سوبر ميسي.
شغال لساته؟
سوبر ميسي جديد حبيبي بكره يا شباب اسمعوا اذا تبع السوبر ميسي ما كرك سكيت ادخلوا بوجهي قولوا فهد ما قالها.
اللي تبع السكيت كرك سوبر ميرسي.
بكره تشوف اذا ما كركوا يا اتش خليك تنيك. هلا اي شيء سكيت عم بيسووا ابديت ايم وير فورا سيم ابديت.
معناتها في عندهم اكسس للسورس كود، هيك قصدك؟ فيها وجهة نظر.
ايه
والله واحدة من التنتين، في احتمال كمان ان سكيت عم يعطي الايم وير عم
هلا
يشتروا
سوبر
منه
ميسي
الشركة.
صار ينزل، هلا صار نزل تشيت نظامي سوبر ميسي.
سوبر ميرسي تشيت من
ايه
زمان.
نظامين.
صار بتحسن.
ايه فيك تشتري من الاي او اس
بقديش؟
$20 بس توي ايم لله. بس شاف رجليك صار يضرب على رجليك. سكيت ما بيضرب على الرجلين مستحيل والله العظيم. لهلا ما شفت واحد سكيتر بيضرب على الرجلين لهلا حتى بحط ليجز كل اشي ما بيضرب على الرجلين. ستومك تشيست هيد.
والله اسمع، في احتمال فهد اني هلا انت مثل ما تقول مزبوط.
انا
هلا
واحد
هن
اسمه
عندهم
ايسك.
ايسك
نايس مان.
فهد ومشغل هذا فالف تشيت بالمناسبة.
ايه مشغل ايه بعرف. هذا تلاقيه سكيتر على فكرة.
لا فالف هذا تشيت. شغل فالف هذا تشيت.
هذا عرفت هذا حتى بالجروب تبعنا. انت من دبي هذا؟
إيه
والله من دبي والله.
بس ما هو سكيتر، مشغل فالف يا حبيبي.
هلا شوف
هذا تشيت النيم تاج تبعه.
يا ايسك
ايش؟
يا فهد
هلا شو مشغلين؟
هلا انت لا ما شفتهم مشغلين.
هلا طلع كلام تاج لما مات مصاصة.
ايه طلع في عندي واحد نيم تاج لإله
والله
ايسك. لك كيف عم يحكي. ايه مدري بيصطفوه كلهم ما شلون.
هلا اسمع، انا عندي كمان فكره فهد. هلا هن انت مثل ما عم تقول عندهم اكسس للسورس كود اكيد، لان هن ما مستحيل يكونوا لحقوا يعملوا لك كودينج بنهارين. عرفت علي؟ فممكن يكون السكيت عم بيعون الشغلات، مو ضروري يكون هنا عندهم اكسس. والله
ليه ما عم بيضربوا الهيد تبعي؟
اوكي شباب، انا بدي ابلش دراسه.
And changing trends and fashions. Fast food in France, inferior good. Incomes have been falling in France, pushing up the demand for an inferior good like fast. Hi everybody, with exams round.
عم يضرب على راسي، حاطط على فكرة الفوف 1000 ما شفتني براسي من الانتي ام.
في كمان هاك منيح يا مصاصة.
شو؟
ليمونس.
والله؟ هذا جديد؟
لا
هذا كمان بس ما بيطلع صار.
Hi everyone, welcome to my A2 macroeconomics playlist and my IB development economics playlist. Those of you that do IB know that development is a big part of the course, but even in A2 macro, development is getting even bigger. It's becoming a prominent feature of exam material. Development economics is a growing field in the whole wider world of the science, and therefore it's important that we cover it and we cover it in detail. This video is going to start by looking at what we mean by economic development, and it's important for you guys as students not to think of economic development as one nice, precise kind of thing. It doesn't have one clear definition to it. It's something that encompasses lots of different aspects. So to understand development, it's only right that we look at what our forefathers of development economics have said. Amartya Sen, Michael Todaro. These are two guys that have driven the field forward. Two guys that are pretty much the godfathers of development economics. So, at the top, we've got Sen's definition, and in green down below, we have Michael Todaro's definition. It's important you guys know both and can reference both. So let's have a look at Amartya Sen. The key thing is he said it's a process. It's something that doesn't just happen, it takes something to get it going. It's a process of improving people's well-being and quality of life, and that involves improving standard of living, yes, but also lots of other things like reducing poverty, improving health and education, and also increasing freedom and economic choice. So you can see here that an increase in quality of life and well-being is not just increasing income, It's lots and lots and lots of different things too. Tadaro goes one stage further. He agrees with what Sen has said, but he, just to keep things simple, breaks development down into 3 different kind of sections. And he thinks that for development to be achieved, all 3 things need to be achieved. He starts by saying that life-sustaining goods like food, shelter and health need to be available for all and need to be distributed to all in the economy. Number 1. Once that's been achieved, he then says people need to have a decent standard of living, both material and non-material. This means they need to have access to education so that they can actually have access to decent jobs in the economy, which will give them an income to support themselves and their family. So material and non-material standards of living to be achieved. Number 3, he then argues that people have to be free to make choices, social choices and economic choices, to get them away from misery, to make them feel happy, to prevent coercion by the government and by transnational corporations or just large corporations in that economy. Freedom of choice, which Sen also agrees with. So Sen and Tadaro's definitions here, we need to be able to define these perfectly. So then when we write an essay on development, when we talk about development outcomes being achieved, we can make reference to what Sen and Tadaro have said. That will transform us from an average student to a very, very good-looking student in an exam situation. So take away this. Development is a bit of a normative concept. We can't define it neatly, but we can use Sen and Tadaro to guide us further. Bear this in mind. Thanks very much, guys. See you next time.
Hej, jag heter Henrik Fexeus. Välkommen till det 3:e avsnittet av Den som ser vinner.
Right, so we've covered what development encompasses, and we've realised that an increase in incomes is only part of what development actually means, according to Sen and Tadaro. We know that actually development encompasses far more. So let's now tackle a very important topic in development economics, which is the relationship between growth and development. A key thing for you to take away is that growth does not equal development. Just because there is high GDP growth, it doesn't necessarily mean that an economy is developing based on what we defined development to be in the previous video. So what we're going to do here is high GDP why growth is beneficial for development. We'll then look at the limitations of growth, and then we'll come to this final conclusion down below that growth is necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for economic development to be achieved. So first of all, why is growth good for development? Well, obviously, an increase in growth is going to mean higher incomes for those within that country. And with higher incomes, that implies that maybe jobs have been created. That implies that the quality of life of people may well improve as they're able to buy more goods and services. Their material standard of living has improved, just as Tadaro said was a key factor in achieving development. And what you'll notice here, when I talk through these benefits and limitations, I'm always coming back to development outcomes that Sen and Tadaro have mentioned. And if you do this in an essay, instead of just stopping at higher incomes, then you will score the high marks. So make sure you do this. The bits in black down the side are very, very important. Higher incomes can also reduce income inequality in the country, which is very important. It also promotes a reduction in poverty. So all these things are very important in achieving development outcomes, and they all come about through higher incomes, basically higher GDP per capita, which we can imply will happen when growth increases. Firms, we can also imply, will make higher profits, their confidence will improve, they're more willing to hire people, they're going to be able to make greater sales as incomes in the economy grow. In that sense, their profits may well increase, and if firms use those profits to reinvest in the economy or reinvest back into their own firm, they can advance technology. And an advancement in technology can actually mean that the dualistic economic structures in the economy can well disappear. We can move away from agriculture-based production in the economy towards more service-based production or more manufacturing-based production. And that requires an improvement in technology. So if firms are making higher profits, they can invest those and develop this technology to break away from dualism, to move towards more sustainable approaches to growth, towards more inclusive types of production, such as manufacturing and service sector creation, job creation. At the same time, with more profits being made and more investment taking place, we can well see firms actually increasing the number of jobs out there in the economy, needing more people to produce goods and services to satisfy higher demand in the economy. So high job creation, again, is great for development. At the same time, growth can also produce what we call a fiscal dividend, a very nice kind of term for you to use in your essay, and this is big. If there is growth in the economy, we can presume that there'll be higher income tax collection. We can presume with higher profits, there'll be higher corporation tax collection. We can also assume that expenditure taxes like VAT, the revenue collected from those will also increase, all creating a fiscal dividend, basically higher fiscal revenues for the government. And if the government is efficient, if their motives are pure, then they're going to spend this money on areas that promote development, such as healthcare, such as education, such as infrastructure like roads, like bridges, like sanitation, like telecommunications. All these key bits of infrastructure that actually promote development out there in the economy. So whenever you talk about fiscal dividend, whenever you talk about revenues increasing for the government, you must come to these three fundamental pillars of development: health, education, infrastructure, all massive drivers of development. However, there are major limitations of growth. Growth is not all-encompassing, and like I've said, growth is not always necessarily equal development. Why? Well, number one, there is no guarantee that growth is going to be equally distributed in the economy. Incomes, in that sense, may well differ. There might be a lot of people in the economy with very high incomes, and lots of people in the economy with much lower incomes, in which case the standard of living has not increased for all. There is no equality in standard of living. There is no equality in how people are in terms of well-being, in which case that's not achieving economic development. You just have to look at major advanced economies, in fact. Look at the UK, look at the USA. At the moment, we would argue that they are very unequal when it comes to income distribution. Even though GDP is increasing at the moment, people would argue that they're not feeling that increase in wealth. It's not being distributed equally. And even in less advanced economies, in your African economies, in places like India, China, we can argue that income inequality is a major issue that's actually hindering development. So although growth is increasing, and especially in China increasing very rapidly, we can argue that maybe economic development is not increasing at the same pace because of income inequality. Number two is a very important point. With growth in developing countries, often what comes about as well are major negative externalities like pollution, like resource depletion, like resource degradation. In the short term, if we exploit all of our natural resources, if we extract them all from the ground and we export them, we produce lots of them, we sell them, that's great in the short term, that's going to lead to growth. But in the long term, if we deplete all our resources, where does our growth come from? It's not sustainable. At the same time, if what we are extracting and
بدك تضحك شباب.
بدنا نيفني.
نحن ثلاثة. ايمن بدك تضحك؟
والله كراش السيرفر بدنا نلعب.
لك صعيب بيحا واحد كرش لي السيرفر. لا صعيب انقطع عندي الانترنت. كرت السيرفر نعمل له كراش بيحا بعد تذكرت انقطع الانترنت ورحت.
عادي من الدراسة الزايدة هيك.
ايمن قال بدك تضحك قاعد على بدر صار له ديفلوبمنت. حلو؟ ففي سكشن اسمه انكم ايكواليتي. فشو عم بيحكي؟ قال اليو كي ما فيها انكم ايكواليتي لاني وقت ارتفع الجي تي بي فيها. الجي تي بي هو شو قد البلد بينتج، عرفت علي؟ وقت ارتفع الانتاج بالبلد ما ارتفع مستوى المعيشة عند الناس كتير. هلا الناس politicians، شو politicians؟ سياسيين قال بدهم يغيروا النظام بالكي بريطانيا. قال ليش؟ قال لاني ارتفع المستوى، ارتفع الانتاج وما ارتفع المعيشة لدي. بيحكوا على السعودية هدول. روحوا شوفوا ايش قد البلد عم انتج وشو قد مستوى المعيشة لدي.
يا اخي اتركوا السعودية بحالها، لا تدخل بامورنا.
اخي لا تتدخل.
والله هذا شيء يخصنا.
يخصك؟
هذا شيء يخصنا، يخص الامير بتاعنا.
بس والله معلم انسى تحكي.
صحيح. انت راح تخلص كم نتيجة؟
رايحة تخلص 9-1، بس اني على السريع عم نخلصها، بس عم نطحش نوت.
يعني اروح العب لعبه ثانيه ولا
لا خلصت.
لا
نصحى شو بنوتلون بسرعه ما في.
انا حكيته من ساعه، قلت له نشوف ايمن قال ما بده يلعب.
ايه هذا اتش بي
انا
كي
ما
صار
كنت
عم يحكي عنك.
لا انا ما كنت موجود.
انا قلت شو قلت لكم لو ايمن بده يلعب كان بالتيم.
انا هذا مو بالتيم سبيك انسى. ليش؟ لاني اقل شيء بدي لعبه كامله لحتى افتح جهازي. اذا قلت لك انا جاي يعني شلون؟ اذا حكيت لك راح افتح الجهاز تلعبوا جيم كامله وبعدين ما افتح.
هذا قصدي انا. مضبوط حكي ايمن ولا لا؟
صحيح.
ايوه عم كيما ما يقول لك خطا كلامك صديق.
طيب I go back to study اوكي.
روح ادرس.
Fucking go to one kitchen.
Producing is polluting the environment, it's leading to a loss of maybe biodiversity, or it's actually reducing health in the economy because people have to inhale toxic smoke or something. That's going to reduce people's well-being in the economy. That's not improving people's living standards in the economy, in which case that's a drag on development. Even though it may lead to growth, it's not actually leading to development. And GDP on its own doesn't tell us that. It just tells us how much we're producing, not whether what we're producing is actually harming the economy as well, or harming individuals as well. And number 3, where is growth actually taking place? If growth is taking place in one dominant sector, again, there is no guarantee that that's going to benefit the whole of society, the whole economy. A great example of this is Nigeria. Nigeria is an economy that's very oil dependent. It's got a huge oil sector. And in fact, that's what drives the economy. But as a result of growth from the oil sector in Nigeria, there is no guarantee, in effect, it doesn't happen, that incomes in that sector are distributed to the rest of the economy. It's just those who are involved in the oil sector that benefit from the increasing growth from oil, or from the oil sector. In which case we can argue that growth in one dominant sector is not necessarily going to lead to development in the rest of the economy or for the rest of society. So that's another point worth considering as a limitation to growth on its own. Therefore, we can see that growth in the right areas is beneficial. If growth takes place which actually generates a fiscal dividend, which is then redistributed in the rest of the economy in these 3 pillars, then great. If growth is leading to higher incomes, which is benefiting the whole of the economy and everyone in society, then great. That's fine. So inclusive growth is great. However, if growth is not inclusive, if there are these limitations, then growth on its own may not lead to development. So therefore, we must finish with this key conclusion that growth is important. We can't get development without growth. However, on its own, it's not the only sufficient condition that leads to development. There are lots of other things that need to happen as well. There needs to be strong government. There need to be firms that have the incentives to reinvest. There needs to be a way of redistributing income throughout the economy, etc., etc. And if these aren't taking place, then growth may not lead to development. And that's a key thing to take away. Growth is a necessary condition, yes, but it's not sufficient in achieving development. Bear that in mind as you write a very important essay on this crucial relationship in economics. Thanks very much for watching. See you all next time.
Missa inte Green Friday den 27 april. Första dealen släpps vid midnatt.
When we consider and assess developing countries in the world, they often tend to share very similar characteristics. And knowledge of what these characteristics are can then aid us, or aid government politicians and aid NGOs and people involved in development outcomes to actually achieve development in such countries, overcoming these characteristics or knowing what these characteristics are. So it's important that we can also do that, and we also know what the common characteristics of developing countries are. These are the big ones, okay, so the main 8, and we're going to come to this main conclusion at the bottom at the end of the video. So, one dominant feature of developing countries is that there tends to be very low standards of living. That manifests in low incomes, it manifests in poor job creation, and it manifests in quite high levels of poverty. So low standards of living. There tend to be low levels of productivity, a lack of investment is a prominent feature in such economies, and also a lack of capital. Lack of availability of capital, we could argue as well, which means productivity levels are very, very low. And coupled with low levels of savings, people tend to be trapped in very kind of poorly paid jobs that don't really produce very much anyway, and therefore the chance of earning higher incomes and getting out of a poverty trap are very, very low. So low levels of savings because there is a lack of financial institutions available, in the economy. There's a lack of education about where to save the money and why saving is important, and very simply incomes are low. So to actually save money is difficult in the first place, to have anything to save. So these two things very much go together, and a lack of savings also fuels a lack of productivity, a lack of investment, a lack of capital. High population growth, again, is a dominant feature of these countries. Often subsistence is still what is sought after among poor families in developing countries. They tend to give birth a lot because the more children they have, the more chance of using those children very simply in the future as workers on farms, in agricultural sectors, for these children to then work and then to generate an income to support the family. That's still very much a dominant feature of how families in developing countries tend to think still. So high population growth to fuel that motive. Agricultural dependence. I say primary sector dominance, yes, but especially agriculture at the heart of these economies. A lot of these developing countries tend to be blessed with natural resources, and these countries plough a lot of the factors of production in the agricultural sector for that reason. They promote growth from this sector. But again, because of low capital, low investment, agriculture on its own doesn't necessarily lead to higher incomes and high growth, high development. But anyway, that is a common feature. Dualistic structures, heavily agricultural based production. Number 6, incomplete markets. So again, lack of financial institutions doesn't help with this. A lack of a hard currency. A lot of these currencies tend to be soft, and they tend not to be wanted by other economies, which holds back the development of markets in such developing countries. Incomplete markets, lack of provision.
User left your channel.
Provision of property rights as well doesn't help that. So that's a major problem. High unemployment and high underemployment as well. So high unemployment, we've said, comes back to the fact that production in the economy is dominated from the agricultural sector, where there is low productivity. Low savings means investment is very low, access to capital is low, and all this does is hinder potential employment prospects. The fact that there isn't another sector to go to, the fact that education is very low in the economy as well, means that for people to get jobs is very difficult. To find jobs is difficult. And even those that do find jobs often tend to be underemployed. It's hard for them to find a full-time job. At the same time, there are lots of people in these economies that maybe have just given up looking for jobs. So the unemployment rate may not actually be a true reflection of how many people don't have a job. These people that are, you could say, hidden unemployed, or have just been so demoralized they've left the workforce, means that the unemployment rate may actually be way higher than what it actually tells us, because these people are not included in our measure of unemployment. And finally, low economic power in the international stage. These countries, compared to advanced economies, don't have much of a say when it comes to international agreements, when it comes to international cooperation. As a result, it means that they can't manipulate situations in the international and the globalized world to suit them. They can't find a way to trade more. They can't find a way to reduce tariffs placed on their goods. They can't talk about trade relations very easily. They can't talk about accessing finance very easily because they don't have the power on the international stage to get their voice across. So all these are common characteristics, and what we can actually say is that a lot of these characteristics can be barriers to growth and development in these countries. So again, for us to have an understanding of this is crucial, because when we talk about barriers to development, we will come to a lot of these things. And again, when it comes to promoting development, we need to know what the characteristics are of developing countries so that we can overcome some of these barriers. But a key thing to finish on is that all developing countries will not have all of these characteristics. Not all developing countries are the same. They all have their diverse characteristics too, which is very important for us to consider. Different resource endowments, different specialties in the labour force, different political structures, different historical backgrounds, etc., etc., etc. We need to consider those too and realise that each country on its own is very unique. We can't just look at pursuing development generically. We have to look at each country specifically and target modes of promoting development that are, again, specific, and useful for that one individual country based on that individual country's characteristics. So bear that in mind as we move forward. But thanks very much for watching. This is a very important video. Keep it close and keep it fixed in your head. Thanks very much. See you next time. Hi everyone. Right, now that we have a really good understanding of what development actually is, we now need to try and find a way to measure development so that we can compare if a country is progressing or not. And we can compare relative to other countries too. Without a measure, how can we do that? So what I'm going to do in this video is look at these single indicators as a measure of development. Right? Single indicators, very simply, are indicators that just look at one thing in isolation. Straight away, you should know there's a problem with that because development encompasses lots and lots of different things. So are single indicators really the best way of doing it? Well, we'll discuss that later. But anyway, these are the single indicators that we can use, and let's develop each one. So to measure development, we can use GDP per capita. And in fact, lots of countries do use GDP per capita as a major way of looking at development. What is GDP per capita? Well, it's basically the average income per person in the economy. So you take GDP, your total GDP, how much you're producing in your economy, divide that by your population, and you get GDP per capita, income per person. Now, as we've talked about, GDP has got lots of limitations to it, so whether we can use GDP or not is debatable. On the one hand, it can be useful to give you a blank measure of incomes. We know that actually development encompasses way more than just an increase in incomes. GDP doesn't tell us about income inequality, about pollution, negative externalities, etc., etc., as we've discussed before. So major limitations to GDP per capita. However, GDP per capita is becoming less used these days. What we tend to use more is GNI per capita instead of GDP per capita. And that's simply because of what tends to happen in developing countries. GDP is just a measure of how much production is taking place in one country, regardless of who's actually producing. So any production taking place in the country is GDP. The value of that production is calculated and totaled up to give you GDP. However, GNI looks at the income generated by all of a country's factors of production, regardless of where they may be operating. Now, for most developing countries, GNI per capita is used far more. Why? Because lots of its factors of production may not stay in the country. They may well leave the country and produce elsewhere. Labour is a classic example. A lot of labour in one developing country may not necessarily stay in those borders. They may go to advanced economies and work there. Right? India is a classic example of this. A lot of Indian labour actually leaves India and end up working in the USA, in Australia, in the UK, or in Europe, for example. Now that's still Indian factor of production. That's still something that India has generated, wealth that India has generated, but it wouldn't be included in GDP, although it might be an increase in wealth. It may well be considered an increase in wealth for India, because a lot of that income tends to be repatriated, tends to be given back to the Indian economy, transferred back to India. So it's argued that GNI maybe should be used for that reason. Wealth that's generated by a country's factors of production is often still diverted back in the economy. Another argument as to why GNI should be used instead of GDP is because GDP, like I said, accounts for all production in the economy, regardless of who's actually producing it. So for developing countries, they can attract a large amount of foreign direct investment because they have abundant resources, they have cheap labour, they have low regulations, etc., etc. However, a lot of the profits made by foreign companies, by multinational corporations, is often repatriated back to the advanced economy. So that money often doesn't stay in the developing country. So it's no good saying that, oh, growth has increased, this is great, GDP per capita has increased because we've had lots of FDI, if a lot of that money is actually being sent back away from the economy. So another argument why maybe GDP per capita shouldn't be used, GNI per capita should be used instead to take into account remittances in the economy as opposed to FDI, which is inflating GDP per capita when it doesn't actually give us a true measure of real income per capita. But going one stage further, even if we do accept GNI per capita as our use, we don't just want to look at the nominal figure generated. We want to look at the purchasing power of people's income. Now this is another very important concept, because when we get a blank measure of GDP or GNI per capita, what that doesn't tell us is how far that money can go. And if we try and convert GDP per capita figures in lots of different countries, if we look at their own currency, it becomes hard to actually manipulate it. So this is what happens. GDP per capita is calculated, or GNI per capita is calculated in a developing country. That income is then converted to a currency that is accepted worldwide, a currency that a lot of people understand, like the US dollar. It's traded the most in the whole world, people understand what its worth is, etc. So that currency, that GDP per capita is then converted to US dollars. That allows us to make comparisons of what GDP per capita is like between different countries. Right? It gives us a measure of what wealth is actually like in different countries. But, like I've just said, that figure doesn't actually tell us what the purchasing power of that income is. Look at India again, stick to India's example. India's GDP per capita is approximately $1,500 US at the moment. Now that sounds very, very low compared to, let's say, the UK, where in dollars it's more like 40,000 US dollars. So you would think, oh my god, that India is much worse off than the UK is, based on this calculation here. But actually, if we look at purchasing power, we'll get a very different story. The same basket of goods and services in India will cost much less than the same basket of goods and services in the UK. What we're trying to say is that India's income, India's per capita income, can actually go much further based on costs of living in India than it can in the UK. In which case, $1,500 in terms of India GDP per capita is worth far more than the same amount of income in the UK. $1,500 in India can go much further than $1,500 in the UK. It can buy much more things in India. Well, that needs to be accounted for. If the purchasing power of India's income is much higher than what it would be in the UK, then that needs to be accounted for, and that's what PPP does. So when we take into account that goods and services tend to be much cheaper in India than in other countries, India's PPP GDP per capita rate is more like $3,000. It's much higher. Right? So that's very important to consider. Purchasing power is what we use when we measure GNI per capita or GDP per capita, to give us a measure of purchasing power of an income, of a currency. That's far more important than the nominal GDP per capita or the nominal GNI per capita. Very important distinction there. However, there are limitations in GDP or GNI regardless, as we've just said. So therefore, maybe health measures are better. What do we mean by health measures? Well, health measures like life expectancy, maybe infant mortality. You measure these two things and you see progression over time, that could be a good measure of development. That could be a good sign that development outcomes are being achieved positively. Why? Let's just look at life expectancy. If life expectancy is going up, what does that mean? It means that health institutions, hospitals, GP surgeries, etc. are of good quality. It means there are lots of doctors out there that are able to treat patients, which implies that jobs are out there, which is good. That implies that education must be strong for doctors to actually exist. It also implies that other parts of the economy might be doing well too. Areas of infrastructure like sanitation facilities might be good. It means that access to hospitals might be strong for people to actually get there, etc., etc. It must mean that maybe education of how to stay away from major diseases like AIDS, like malaria, may be strong. It must imply that treatment options to treat these diseases must be strong, etc., etc. So if there is high life expectancy, it can imply that lots of good development outcomes are being achieved in the country. So maybe health measures is a way of monitoring development and measuring development. Similarly, maybe we can look at education measures. What kind of education measures can we use? Well, we can look at adult literacy. Maybe we can look at enrollment in primary education. And just like with health, if there is ever increasing or bettering adult literacy, this implies that development outcomes are improving in the economy. It implies that educational institutions are strong. It implies that there are teachers out there getting jobs that can educate people. It implies that as a result of greater literacy, there may be the potential for gaining higher skilled jobs improves. It implies that the number of people that can actually take jobs will improve, which implies that unemployment will fall, which implies that incomes may improve, etc., etc. So it makes sense again that maybe an education measure could be a good measure of development generally. However, overall, are single indicators really the best way to measure development? When Sen and Tadaro say that actually lots of different factors should be considered when we talk about economic development. Not just education on its own, not just health on its own, not just income on its own. What about reductions in poverty? What about increases in freedom and choice? What about reductions in income inequality? All these things have also been talked about by Sen and Tadaro, which these things on their own will not be able to measure, will not be able to give us an indication of. So maybe a more all-encompassing measure, maybe instead of a single indicator, an indicator which takes into account different factors should be considered. We'll look at those factors in a future video. Thanks very much for watching this, a very important video this one. See you next time. Hi everyone! Having understood different single indicators to measure economic development and the limitations of them, let's now consider composite indicators, different measures of development that encompass more than just one indicator. I'm going to focus in this video on the Human Development Index, which is internationally acclaimed and recognised as being the main way of measuring development. I'm also going to mention briefly the Millennium Development Goals. I'm not going to make a video on the Millennium Development Goals, but it's worthwhile you knowing that as well, to use in your essay to make sure that you're aware that there are different ways of measuring progress, and whether countries are achieving Millennium Development Goals is another way to consider and measure progress. But I'm not going to focus on Millennium Development Goals at all. They're quite simple. You just need to know what the 9 goals are and you'll be fine. Alright, let's look at the Human Development Index then. An index that was developed by Marty Sen and another Pakistani-based economist. And what they tried to do was include as many important indicators of development as possible within one measure. So it is an index, it's calculated just like an index normally is calculated, but it constitutes 3 key things. 3 key things here in green which are weighted equally, so they're just as important as each other. Equal weightings given to each 3 in this index. So what's actually measured? Well, longevity. Now, the key thing for you to realise is that these words at the top, longevity, knowledge, standards of living, yes, they're important to know, but what's more important is to understand how they are measured. So longevity, very simply, think of it as life expectancy at birth. That's measured. So there is a health indicator in there. There is an education measure in there. We're trying to measure knowledge. How is that measured? Well, adult literacy is used. School enrollment is used. Okay, so these are 2 measures of knowledge. Also, standard of living is actually measured too. And how is that measured? We use GDP per capita, PPP, to come up with a measure of standard of living. So together, these 3 things are calculated, they are put into this index, they're weighted equally, and given the actual mathematical calculations involved, a figure is then generated, which is the Human Development Index for a given country. So, the numbers can range between 0 and 1. 1 representing perfect development, based on Sen and Qureshi, the Pakistani economists' interpretation of what perfect development is. Whereas 0 implies that development is just non-existent. There is absolutely 0 development out there. They go one stage further, they break the numbers down to say between 0 to 0.49, low development, between 0.5 and 0.69 is medium development, between 0.7 and 0.79 is high development, and anything greater than or equal to 0.8 represents a very high development. So countries that achieve very high development are countries like the UK, Australia, Canada, Singapore, Norway, Denmark. These are all countries that regularly feature in the top 10 very high developed countries. Whereas in the very low developed country base, you tend to have your sub-Saharan African countries, which dominate that bracket there. So, understanding what the HDI is, what it measures, how to interpret the numbers, we now need to think of why the HDI is a good measure of development. Here are the arguments why HDI is actually quite good, and in red the arguments why HDI maybe is not the best indicator in the world as well. So, what is beneficial about the HDI? Well, it's a broad measure. Look at what it's including. Not just one factor, not just one key area of development, but lots of different ones, 3 different ones. And these were all previously what we considered single indicators. Now we can bring them all together, and we get to one key measurement of development using the HDI, which is fantastic. So it's broad, and it still includes what we would consider a very important a very important factor of development, which is GDP per capita. Okay, so we find a way to bring all these different single indicators together to give us one number at the end. It focuses very importantly on development outcomes. Look at what we're actually measuring here. We're measuring adult literacy, school enrollment, life expectancy. These are all key development outcomes. To focus on these things, you could argue, is a major benefit. It allows for progress to be measured over time. So by giving you one figure, let's say in a given year, you can then look in 10 years' time as to whether your HDI has improved or not. So it's very useful for comparison purposes, not just for your own country, but to compare with other countries too, to see where your development is actually matching other countries' development. And it means that international bodies, international organizations, maybe like the World Bank, maybe like different NGOs that may exist, can actually focus their attention now on countries with very low levels of development. The HDI gives us an idea of which countries are very lowly developed, and therefore maybe aid can be diverted to these countries that need it the most. So in that sense, allocating resources becomes more efficient, knowing which countries need resources the most. However, the HDI does have its limitations. There is no mention of income distribution at all in this, even though Sen and Tadaro both argue that income inequality does need to be considered when we look at development. Why are these 3 things weighted equally? For some countries, it may be argued that GDP per capita is far more significant as a driver of development. It may be argued that in some countries, the fact that education is so limited means that to actually focus on that is more important, so maybe that deserves a higher weighting. But the HDI doesn't consider that. All these 3 things are weighted equally. And you may argue that that's quite arbitrary, that's a bit random. And what it means is that to then allocate resources to areas where we need them most becomes difficult. Within these 3 things, let's say the health sector in the economy is where development is really lacking. That's where many resources need to be allocated to. But the HDI doesn't tell us that it's health that's kind of dominating the lack of development. It doesn't give us that because these 3 things are weighted equally. So therefore the allocation of resources may not be as efficient as we would hope because we don't know exactly where the problems are actually lying. We don't know that maybe education is dominating the lack of development in a given country. Freedom and choice, both Sen and Tadaro talk about that in the definition. Where is that measured in the HDI? It's not. Similarly, other factors like crime, like poverty levels, like corruption are all not included, like the costs of negative externalities are not included in the HDI. So you could argue, okay, it may be broad, but is it as broad as we would want it to be? Because we know development includes lots of different things. We're only still looking at 3 things. Yes, 3 very important things here, but still only 3 things. But a counter to this argument is that, well, maybe its selectivity here is what makes it such a renowned and acclaimed measure of development. The fact that the 3 most important pillars of development are being looked at here is maybe what makes it such a good measure. That's a good counter-argument to some of the arguments against the HDI here. Okay. So the HDI, that is very much the big daddy of development measurement indicators. It's a composite indicator, and that's why it's considered to be quite a good one. If you're studying A2, you might also need to know about the ISEW, which is a sustainable indicator of development that you can also revise in your own time. But the HDI is the most important. I hope that makes sense. Thank you very much. Keep this very clear in your head, and I'll see you all next time.
Du är också med, Agria. Det borde alla vara, eller hur?
Hi everyone. I've mentioned a few times that income inequality can be a major barrier to development for developing countries. I've also mentioned that the given ways that we measure development doesn't actually include income inequality in that measure. So the HDI, for example, single indicators like GDP per capita does not give us a representation of income inequality in the economy. So it's important, therefore, if we're measuring the progress of an economy, to use indicators like the HDI, but to also use measurements of income inequality to give us a true measure of progress. So how do we measure income inequality in economics? Well, we use two things. We use the Lorenz curve to give us a visual interpretation of income inequality, and we use the Gini coefficient to give us a mathematical interpretation. Here's how the Lorenz curve works. Let's start by looking at the axis. When we draw a Lorenz curve, our axis needs to be labelled like this. On the y-axis, we have the cumulative percent of income in an economy. On the x-axis, we have the cumulative percent of the population in an economy. The word cumulative is important. All it means is up to and including. So if we're looking at the 60th percent of income, let's say, within that, well, we're also considering the previous 59% worth of income in the economy. So up to and including, right? It's very important. The diagonal line represents perfect equality. It represents a perfectly direct relationship between population and the amount of income. So basically 10% of the population will earn 10% of the income, according to this line. 50% of the population will earn 50% of the income, etc. So this line represents a direct relationship between population and income. Let's say on the left we're looking at Australia, on the right we're looking at Vietnam. Let's draw a Lorenz curve, shall we, for Australia. Australia's Lorenz curve may look something like this. Because the Lorenz curve is not the line of perfect equality, it implies that there is some inequality here. And if we look carefully, we can see that, let's say, the last 10% of the population are earning substantially more of the income than the first 10% of the population. So we can see here that any time the Lorenz curve, in black here, any time the Lorenz curve is away from the line of perfect equality, there is some income inequality out there. And basically, the further away the line is, the more income inequality there is. So in Australia, the Lorenz curve is not that far away from the line of perfect equality. There is some inequality in Australia, but not a huge amount. Whereas in Vietnam, there is a much greater amount of inequality, which means its Lorenz curve may look something like this. That could be the Lorenz curve of Vietnam, and you can see it's much further away from the line of perfect equality than Australia's Lorenz curve is. And if you look at this Lorenz curve very closely, the first, let's say, 20% of the population are earning a very small percent of the income, maybe 5% of the income. Whereas the last 20% of the population are earning potentially 50% of the income. So again, the further away the line is from the line of perfect equality, the more the income inequality there is. And that can be visually seen on these two diagrams. Going one stage further, the Gini coefficient can actually give us a measure of how much inequality there is. The Gini coefficient takes what the Lorenz curve is saying, what the Lorenz curve is visually saying, and provides a number to that. How does it do it? Well, there is a formula. So first of all, let's stick some letters on our Lorenz curve diagrams. The Gini coefficient puts a value on these areas, and then calculates a figure based on this equation. So it measures the value, or the area, inside the Lorenz curve, but outside the line of perfect equality, and then it divides that by the total area underneath the line of perfect equality. And then the figures we can get will either be, well, will be between 0 and 1. 0 implies perfect equality, where 1 represents perfect inequality. And again, this makes complete sense. This makes complete sense because if the figure is 0, what does it imply? It implies there is no section A. There is only a section B. There is only an area outside the Lorenz curve, which is section B. Section A doesn't exist. There is no area inside the Lorenz curve at all, because the Lorenz curve is the line of perfect equality, which means section A is 0. So 0 divided by a number is going to be 0, which implies that we are at the line of perfect equality. Whereas if the figure is 1, what does it imply? It implies that section A is all that exists. There is no section B. Because if there is perfect inequality, then the Lorenz curve essentially is the x-axis and it's the line going directly above there. So it's essentially this, these two lines together. Is the Lorenz curve, there is perfect inequality, which means that the last person in the economy is earning all of the income in the economy. Perfect inequality. And if that's the case, then there is only section A that exists. There is no section B. So it's going to be the same number over the same number, which gives us a figure of 1. But very simply, the way to interpret the Gini coefficient, the closer the figure is towards 0, the more equal income distribution is. The closer the figure is towards 1, the more unequal income distribution is. And that's an important way to manipulate these figures and to interpret these figures. In an exam, you might be asked to show an economy moving from a very unequal distribution of income to a more equal distribution of income. You can do that on one Lorenz curve. So let's take Vietnam. Let's say in a case study that was being said, and for an exam question you have to show that. On one diagram you would say, right, as the case study says, income distribution in Vietnam is becoming more equal. This can be shown on my Lorenz curve, where initially income distribution was quite unequal, and the new Lorenz curve is showing a more equal distribution of income. Okay? So learn the Lorenz curve as a visual interpretation, learn the Gini coefficient as a mathematical understanding of what the Lorenz curve is saying, and you have your perfect measures of income inequality. I hope this video helps. Keep this in mind. See you all next time. Hi everyone. Now that we've understood what development means and different ways to measure it, let's look at institutional factors within a country that can lead to development, that are important for development to occur. And in an essay, these are the 3 big ones that we must always come back to when we talk about development outcomes being achieved. We look at education, healthcare and infrastructure as major ways of getting development, major ways of getting a developing country to progress. Education. So when we talk about education, it's important not just to stop there. We can't just say, look, this factor, whatever will happen, will lead to more education, which will lead to more development. No. That's poor analysis. That's not going to score many marks. So we need to know that education is important. We need to look at ways of measuring it, like adult literacy, like enrollment rates in education, etc. But we need to look specifically at what the benefits of education are in promoting development. And here they are in green for development. Education leads to high productivity levels, which you know is a major constraint on development. So that's a great thing. The more education there is and the more educated people there are, the greater potential for these people to gain good jobs, to earn higher incomes, to gain a good standard of living, to be able to buy material things that makes their family better off. But also, it promotes choice, which is very important. Social and economic choice, both of which have been mentioned by Sen and Tadaro as fundamental in the pursuit of development. If women are educated, and this is interesting, if women end up being educated, it can promote more gender equality, yes, but also by empowering women in society, you have a greater chance of achieving development outcomes quickly. Why? Because if women are educated and they go and earn money, they go and find jobs, they are more responsible and more willing to spend money on promoting schooling of their children, or promoting health in their family, and making sure that sanitation facilities, cooking facilities, gas, electricity, telecommunications, all these kind of things in their family are taken care of. So if you empower women, you have a greater chance of achieving development and promoting development. So if we educate women, there is a great chance of achieving development outcomes in the future. If you educate well, then you can also have some health benefits. You educate people as to the problems of HIV, the problems of malaria, and how to avoid catching such disease. You educate people about how important sanitation is, how important sewage is, etc. And this is a great way of restricting disease and of making sure that people take vaccinations and know of how to stay away from such major diseases. You can also promote the idea of how contraception can be used to prevent against unwanted pregnancy, which can control the birth rate, high birth rates in these countries. It can also promote the advancement of technology. People have skills and know how to actually pursue the advancement of technology. But barriers to education and barriers to development of education can be funding. Funding is a big, big problem, very expensive thing, very hard to make inclusive. So funding is a major issue here. And if the government can't afford to provide it in its entirety and we allow some private sector involvement here, well then is it right to exclude people based on price? Is it right to charge a price for education? Is that just going to promote greater income inequality? At the same time, you may be dealing with or fighting with underlying problems in the economy or underlying thought processes in the economy, which might be that, you know, as soon as children hit a certain age, they're seen as workers instead of children. So when they hit ages such as 9, 10, 11, a lot of parents will see that age as a time where these kids can actually work on farms and earn incomes for the whole family. So in that sense, we might see a lot of enrollment in primary education, but we may not see much enrollment in secondary education, which can be a limit on the benefits of education and then development. So that's another problem you can be dealing with, cultures and where children may be needed to be used in the economy. With healthcare, what are the benefits of a good healthcare system or healthcare institutions being more developed? Well, again, the healthier people are, the more productive they're going to be. The more jobs potentially can be created in the economy too. If you have lots of hospitals, GP surgeries, lots of places to go, you know, dentist places, etc., then that's going to promote more jobs in the economy. You can imagine with people that are healthier, they're going to be happier. It's going to promote a better standard of living. And as well, it's going to imply, if there is good healthcare in the economy, if there is a good standard of health in the economy, it's going to imply that drinking water must be available, it's going to imply that sanitation must be strong, that sewage is being looked after and regulated well, etc. These are all good things that constitute towards economic development. But again, funding is another major issue here. Who is going to fund this? If governments don't have the finance to fund it, how are we going to ensure that there are healthcare facilities available to all? And if we argue that, again, the private sector maybe should get involved in here to negate the problem of funding, then is it right to exclude people from healthcare based on price? Major arguments and major barriers to development here. And finally, another key pillar of development is infrastructure. Think of infrastructure as all the major things that an economy needs to produce, all the major things that must be in place for economic activity to take place. So we think of infrastructure, we think of roads, we think of the building of schools and hospitals, we think of bridges, we think of ports, we think of airports, we think of telecommunication, we think of sewage, we think of toilets and sanitation facilities. All these things need to exist for economic activity to take place properly. So what are the benefits of an economy having a good infrastructure? Well, it means that access to markets becomes viable. It means firms can transport their goods and services at lower cost. It means consumers can access markets and purchase goods and services at lower prices, which are all very, very important. It means countries can become more competitive. It means that children and people who are sick, who are disabled, can access schools and hospitals, fundamental. It means that foreign countries will look at a developing country and think, oh wow, they have a good infrastructure in place, it's very easy for us to operate our business here, let's invest, which again promotes growth, promotes development in the developing country. But again, major barriers to infrastructure development is funding. These things cost a huge amount of money, building airports, building roads, building bridges. These are all very expensive, and although they are necessary and fundamental to development, there's no guarantee that they will actually take place, given how expensive they are. Okay, so 3 pillars, major pillars of development, which we all need to understand, the intricate benefits of them, and the barriers to them as well. Thanks for watching, see you next time. Hi everyone, let's continue by looking at institutional factors that can promote or hinder development. In the previous video we looked at education, healthcare and infrastructure as our 3 major pillars of development. Here I'm going to look at 4 more, either that promote development or that can hinder development. Let's start by looking at taxation. We called kind of the benefits of tax revenues a fiscal dividend in the previous video. And we said that, you know, when the government gains higher tax revenues, it can use that money to spend on education, health, infrastructure, right? We've talked about this before. However, there are major problems, there are major barriers to efficient use of government tax revenue, and whether that tax revenue will actually promote development, and whether revenues will be generated in the first place or not. Let's consider some of those. Well, first of all, corruption get in the way. Corruption in terms of whether the government or politicians will actually spend this money efficiently, or whether they will just keep the money essentially in their own pockets. And there are questions as to whether politicians and corporations work too closely together, whereby tax exemptions are given to firms or to people when they shouldn't have been given in the first place at all. Self-interested, greedy, poor motives, ulterior motives get in the way of collecting the correct amount of tax revenue. At the same time, we talk about corporation taxes increasing when there is growth in an economy, but in developing countries, that's one avenue of tax revenue that might be quite limited, because there is limited corporate activity that takes place. And even if there is corporate activity, maybe from foreign firms, from MNCs, a lot of the times tax incentives are given to such firms to promote them actually coming and producing in a developing country, which can act as a barrier. There are lots of informal markets in developing countries, which means tax collection will be limited and not at its full potential. And because of an ever-increasing role of the World Trade Organization in the globalized world, tariffs have been falling over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Tariffs are a very easy way of collecting revenue, and for developing countries it's a major source of tax revenue. But with the WTO having a more influential role in trade in the globalized economy, the actual potential of tariff collection has been reduced, which again acts as a barrier to tax revenue collection. Another way in which domestic factors can lead to development is if technology is developed appropriately and used appropriately. An example of appropriate technology for developing countries can be something like a solar cooker. So a gas and electricity might be limited. Innovative ideas like this can overcome such issues, but can also promote development outcomes. Right? So a solar cooker is a very clever way of cooking with hygiene, cooking with cleanliness, but using renewable resources instead of gas and electricity to cook. In India, there is lots of talk about weather-based technology coming forward, where farmers can actually get hold of technology that can forecast weather conditions, that can actually measure weather conditions, and can formulate and give you an idea of weather patterns. But also it can actually measure soil performance, it can measure plant performance, and when to actually take your plants out of the ground, when to actually plant new seeds based on the optimal soil conditions. So all the technology that can give you measures of those things are very useful in improving the productivity on farms and in making sure that growing conditions are as optimal as possible, which can maximize potential harvests. So weather-based technology to help agricultural farmers and producers is another very useful way of promoting development in these countries. We've talked briefly about the empowerment of women. Women can be a great source of growth and development, and at the moment are heavily underutilized, which is why this is actually a major Millennium Development Goal, to ensure that women are more empowered. Why do we want women to have a greater role in the economy or a greater role in society? Well, because if they are educated, if they have a greater role, if they have more power, then they are going to promote development outcomes for the betterment of all of society. They're going to promote the health of their children. They're going to want their children to be vaccinated against key diseases. They're going to make sure that sanitation facilities in their household are as good as possible to ensure health standards are high. They're also going to pursue education, not only themselves, but if they're educated, they're going to understand the value of education for the rest of their family. So again, they're going to make sure that their children are not just educated at primary level, they're going to make sure that they keep going to secondary level and even further, which again will generate higher incomes for the family, and it will mean that, again, for the economy, there are going to be wider benefits to that. The economic impacts of health and education benefits are going to be huge in terms of productivity, in terms of job creation, in terms of incomes, great. And it also means that women might see the need for children to be less, the need to actually give birth to lots of children to be less. If they understand themselves that through education, incomes can be higher, then potentially there is no need to give birth to so many people to work on farms. At the same time, they may understand that contraception is available all of a sudden. They may understand that with better health, with better education opportunities, there is no need to give birth to so many children as well. Okay? So with smaller families and higher income potential, that's again a major benefit of the empowerment of women. And finally, this is a barrier to development: unequal income distribution. We want income to be distributed as evenly as possible. If it's not, there can be major issues. What issues can occur? Well, if there is uneven distribution and only a small percent of the population earning a huge amount of the income in the economy, then those at the lower end are not going to have much income to save. And with a lack of savings, all that's going to promote is more of a lack of investment. Furthermore, in developing countries, those that are rich and earn a lot of the money tend to be the politicians, the bureaucrats. And if they are the ones that set policy, they are going to be surely unwilling to set policy to suit the lower income people. They're just going to set policies that suit themselves. They're not going to really understand what the needs of the poor are in the economy. And similarly, the rich tend to divert money outside the economy. Maybe that's because it's foreign companies that are repatriating profits, maybe it's foreign workers that are sending money back home. Or maybe it's just rich people, domestic citizens in the economy that are looking for investments elsewhere, that are diverting money in other countries for those reasons. Okay? So more institutional factors that either promote development or hinder development. It's important that you know these very, very well. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.
Nu är det superdeals på massa av kända varumärken på...
Let's continue our topic of institutional factors that can promote development. And this time let's look at political stability and political instability. In developing countries, the strength of government is fundamental in ensuring whether development outcomes can be achieved or whether they're not going to be achieved. So if there is political stability, if governments are efficient in allocating resources, if they're efficient in adhering to the needs and wants of the general public, then you can imagine that there'll be huge development gains as a result. Potential increase in foreign investment. It's going to attract firms to come over, knowing that there's no unnecessary bureaucracy, no unnecessary regulation, no unnecessary paperwork or elongating of the business process. It's going to attract foreign investment. It's going to mean that if they need aid, if these countries need aid, they're going to be more likely to get it, knowing that when the money is given to governments, the government is going to redistribute it or use it wisely. It's also going to mean that the needs and wants of the public are going to be listened to. If politicians are elected in power, they're going to stick to adopting the policies that actually got them power in the first place. But if there is instability, and specifically revolutions, wars, any kind of instability in this way, that can be a huge detrimental effect on the economy. You look at Sudan as a prime example. You look at Egypt recently as another good example of how political instability can cause development uproar. What could happen if there is instability? Well, there could be a loss of infrastructure. Wars are a classic example of how modes of transport or transport infrastructure can be destroyed. Telecommunication infrastructure can be destroyed if there is political instability. Similarly, a loss of investment. You're going to reduce potential foreign investment, and potentially you can reduce aid incomes as well. So political instability is detrimental to potential development outcomes being achieved. But just generally, we know how beneficial a strong government can be. Something that can get in the way of that, something that can get in the way of development all the time, is corruption. Now, corruption you can bring into any development essay completely. Any essay you're writing, you can always talk about corruption. It's a major problem. It's a major barrier to development. It's a major hindrance to the progress of these developing countries. And it's important that you as students don't stop at the word corruption. There's a lot of analysis you can go into here. There are a lot of good examples you can give of corruption. So don't just stop at the word corruption, because corruption can take lots of different forms. Okay? It could be in terms of inefficient regulation, right? So if politicians need to enforce regulation, they turn a blind eye to it instead. right? Massive inefficiencies there. It could be in terms of reducing FDI flow. So if there is corruption within government and politicians are not sticking to their word, or if they're acting against what the intentions were in the first place, then that can actually reduce the amount of FDI coming into the country. Corruption can take the form of bribes. It could be bribes in terms of businesses having to pay an extra cost to actually grow their business, or to build factories, or to invest in capital machinery, whatever it might be. The government may actually force bribes to take place first, which increases the cost of producing. It can also mean that actually government investment in key public sector areas like healthcare and education may be put off, knowing that the government can bribe the private sector. And this is a very interesting concept here, because money is often made heavily in the private sector, in the capital sector. So politicians may well actually force people that actually work in these sectors to pay bribes for them to actually pursue profit maximization even further, to pursue growth strategies even further. And in a way, if these people accept these bribes, then what's going to be neglected is spending on education and healthcare instead. So by bribing capital owners and giving them what they want in return, there may be a neglect of investment in healthcare and investment in education, which can be a massive problem as a result. Corruption in terms of allocation of resources or projects being given to the highest bidder instead of to the most efficient producers, which again is a negative of corruption, another way corruption can manifest. And corruption in a legal sense. So if there are any legalities that need pursuing and need enforcing, corrupt authorities or corrupt politicians may again not enforce those legalities and instead just go against them. So in that sense, corruption can be a major problem.
Channel switched.
شباب الو I go shower ماشي.
انا هون
يا اخي صرنا ساعة بنستنى.
طيب I go shower شباب.
اوكي خلص روح نلعب انا وايمن نص ساعة.
لعبوا وحدة، انا بدي ساعة لأخلص.